The San Diego sun hung low over Naval Base Coronado, casting long shadows across the pristine white buildings that house some of the military's most elite warriors. Commander Rachel "Phantom" Chen stepped out of the unmarked sedan that had delivered her from a classified briefing at JSOC headquarters, her polished black shoes barely making a sound against the asphalt. She wore standard Navy working uniform, the blue-gray camouflage pattern that marked her as just another officer among thousands stationed at the sprawling West Coast facility. At 36, Rachel carried herself with the measured grace of someone who had learned to move through the world without drawing unnecessary attention. Her dark hair was pulled back in the regulation bun, not a strand out of place. Her uniform was pressed and proper, bearing the gold oak leaves of a commander, but lacking the specialized insignia that would identify her true assignment. To anyone passing by, she appeared to be exactly what she wanted them to see: another mid-level officer, probably assigned to logistics or personnel management, arriving for a routine administrative appointment. The guard at the main gate barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through. "Welcome to Coronado, ma'am," he said with the practiced politeness of someone who processed hundreds of officers every week. He didn't recognize her face, didn't notice the particular way she scanned the facility's layout with eyes that had memorized terrain in a dozen hostile countries. To him, she was unremarkable, just another uniform in a sea of uniforms. Rachel offered a polite nod and continued toward the administrative complex where she would be spending the next 2 weeks. Her orders were straightforward on paper: conduct a comprehensive review of training protocols and operational readiness standards for Naval Special Warfare Command. What those orders didn't mention was that she would be doing so while deliberately concealing her own background as one of the first female Navy SEALs to complete basic underwater demolition, SEAL training, and subsequently earn one of the most feared call signs in the special operations community. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The mission was unusual even by special operations standards. The Pentagon had received troubling reports about cultural resistance to the integration of women into SEAL teams, including allegations that qualified female candidates were being systematically undermined during training and assessment phases. Rather than conducting a formal investigation that would put everyone on their best behavior, Naval Special Warfare Command had requested Rachel specifically for an undercover evaluation. She would observe, assess, and document the actual attitudes and behaviors of SEAL personnel when they believed no one important was watching. Rachel had accepted the assignment despite knowing it would require her to endure exactly the kind of dismissive treatment she had spent her entire career overcoming. For 2 weeks, she would be Commander Chen, a personnel officer reviewing paperwork and conducting administrative interviews. She would not mention her SEAL qualification, her combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, or the classified missions that had earned her the call sign Phantom, a name given to her by her team after she had single-handedly infiltrated a Taliban compound, extracted 3 captured aid workers, and disappeared back into the Afghan night without a single enemy fighter, realizing she had been there until morning revealed their empty cells. As she walked through the base, Rachel noticed the subtle markers that identified SEAL territory. The buildings became more utilitarian, the personnel more physically imposing. Groups of young men in PT gear jogged past, their bodies honed into weapons through months of the most demanding military training in the world. Some glanced at her with curiosity, others with barely concealed dismissiveness. She was accustomed to both reactions. The administrative office, where she would be stationed, was tucked into a corner of the Special Warfare Center, close enough to SEAL team spaces to observe their daily routines, but separate enough to maintain the fiction of her purely bureaucratic role. A young petty officer named Stevens showed her to a small desk in a shared office space, his demeanor professionally distant. "Ma'am, you'll have access to personnel files and training records through the secure terminal," Stevens explained, gesturing to the computer setup. "Most of the teams are currently running training exercises, so the compound will be pretty active. If you need anything, just let me know." "Thank you, Petty Officer," Rachel replied, noting how his eyes had already dismissed her as irrelevant to the real work happening around them. She was just another administrative officer, probably here to justify some new diversity initiative or update harassment prevention training. He couldn't have known that she had qualified as an expert marksman with 7 different weapon systems, or that the slight scar along her left forearm had come from shrapnel during a firefight in Kandahar, where she had held a defensive position for 40 minutes while her team extracted wounded civilians. Rachel settled into her assigned workspace and began the tedious process of reviewing training documentation, all while keeping her senses attuned to the conversations happening around her. The office shared walls with a briefing room where SEAL teams conducted pre-mission planning, and the soundproofing was imperfect enough that voices occasionally filtered through. She heard the easy camaraderie of men who trusted each other with their lives, the dark humor that helped them process the violence they were trained to inflict, and occasionally, comments about women that ranged from merely dismissive to openly hostile. Over the next several days, Rachel established her routine. She arrived early, worked methodically through personnel evaluations and training records, and asked careful questions during her scheduled interviews with SEAL instructors and team leaders. Her demeanor was pleasant but unremarkable. Her questions focused on procedural details that seemed bureaucratic rather than tactical. She was building a reputation as exactly what she appeared to be, a competent but unexceptional officer fulfilling an administrative requirement. What no one noticed was how much she was actually observing. Rachel had spent years developing the ability to gather intelligence while appearing to do something entirely different, a skill that had served her well during covert operations, and now proved invaluable in this unconventional assignment. She noted which instructors seemed genuinely committed to evaluating candidates fairly regardless of gender, and which ones made subtle comments suggesting that women would never truly belong in SEAL teams. She documented instances where female candidates were held to different standards, sometimes higher and sometimes more insidiously lower, as if to prove they couldn't meet legitimate requirements. Her office was positioned near the main corridor that SEAL team members used to access the training facilities, giving her a clear view of the daily flow of personnel. She watched as teams returned from long training evolutions, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that came from pushing human limits. Some were professional in their demeanor, focused on their mission. Others exhibited the swagger that sometimes came with elite status, a confidence that occasionally tipped into arrogance. One team in particular caught her attention, SEAL Team 5, known for their recent successful operations in the Middle East and their reputation for aggressive training standards. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Brooks, had a stellar operational record but had also been mentioned in several of the complaints that had triggered this investigation. His team included some of the most decorated young SEALs on the West Coast, men who had proven themselves in the most demanding combat environments. Among them was Petty Officer First Class Marcus Reed, a 28-year-old SEAL whose file revealed an interesting contradiction. His operational performance was exceptional: 3 combat deployments, multiple commendations for valor, expert ratings in virtually every tactical skill. But his peer evaluations and instructor feedback during advanced training courses showed a pattern of dismissive comments about female integration into special operations forces. He hadn't done anything that warranted formal discipline, but his attitude represented exactly the kind of cultural resistance that Naval Special Warfare Command was concerned about. Rachel observed Reed during his daily routines, noting how he interacted with other personnel. With his fellow SEALs, he was confident and charismatic, clearly respected by his teammates. With junior enlisted personnel, he was professional but firm. But she noticed how his expression changed when female personnel passed by, a subtle shift that suggested he didn't consider them legitimate members of the operational community. By the end of her first week, Rachel had gathered substantial documentation about training protocols and cultural attitudes, but she hadn't yet experienced the direct confrontation that would provide the most valuable data about how SEAL personnel reacted when they believed their attitudes about women wouldn't have consequences. That opportunity would come soon enough, in a setting where social barriers were lowered and authentic opinions emerged. The SEAL compound had several gathering spaces, but the main mess hall served as the informal heart of the community. Unlike the formal dining facilities where senior officers ate in segregated spaces, the SEAL mess hall was deliberately egalitarian, a place where operators of all ranks could decompress after training, share meals, and build the social bonds that translated into combat effectiveness. It was also, Rachel had observed, where unfiltered opinions emerged most clearly. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of perfect California weather that made San Diego a paradise for military training. Rachel finished reviewing a particularly dense training manual around 1,800 hours and realized she hadn't eaten since her brief breakfast 12 hours earlier. The mess hall would be busy at this hour, filled with SEAL teams finishing their daily training evolutions and gathering for dinner before evening briefs or off-duty time. She considered eating elsewhere. Her quarters had a small kitchenette, and avoiding unnecessary interaction would maintain her low profile. But part of her mission required observing SEALs in their natural social environment, understanding the cultural dynamics that existed when they believed they were among peers. The mess hall offered the best opportunity for that kind of observation. Rachel walked the quarter-mile from her office to the dining facility, her pace measured and unremarkable. The sun was beginning its descent toward the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had allowed herself to notice. But she was in operational mode now, her mind categorizing everything. She observed the security patterns around sensitive buildings, the informal conversations between personnel, the way groups self-segregated along team lines and rank boundaries. The mess hall was housed in a modern building designed to accommodate several hundred personnel at once, with long tables arranged in rows and a serving line offering surprisingly good food given the military setting. The scent of grilled meat and fresh vegetables filled the air, mixing with the distinctive sound of dozens of conversations happening simultaneously. The acoustic design allowed for intimate conversations while still maintaining enough ambient noise to provide privacy. Rachel collected a tray and moved through the serving line, selecting a simple meal of grilled chicken, rice, and steamed vegetables. The staff serving the food were a mix of contractors and junior enlisted personnel who barely registered her presence beyond the basic courtesies required by their positions. She paid with her military ID card and turned to survey the seating options. The mess hall's social geography was immediately apparent. SEAL teams tended to cluster together, their tables marked by the particular energy of men who shared dangerous work and trusted each other completely. Support personnel occupied their own sections, creating an invisible but understood boundary between those who conducted special operations, those who enabled them. Officers generally sat together, though the rank divisions were less rigid here than in conventional military dining facilities. Rachel deliberately chose a small table in a corner that offered good sightlines to most of the mess hall while positioning her at the periphery of the social space. It was the kind of position that allowed observation without appearing to actively surveil anyone. She pulled out a tablet loaded with training documentation, creating the appearance of someone catching up on administrative work during a meal unremarkable and easily ignored. For several minutes, she ate methodically while scanning the documents on her screen, her peripheral vision tracking the various interactions happening around her. She identified several members of SEAL Team 5, including Marcus Reed, who had arrived with 3 of his teammates and claimed a table in a section that clearly belonged to his unit. Their body language suggested they were decompressing. After a long training day, that particular looseness that came when adrenaline faded and muscles relaxed. Reed's voice carried across the mess hall, not shouting but projecting with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. He was telling a story about a training evolution that had apparently gone wrong in an amusing way, drawing laughs from his teammates. Rachel noted the way other SEAL personnel responded to him clearly. He was well liked within his community, someone whose opinions carried weight among his peers. She continued eating and reading, maintaining her unremarkable administrative officer persona while gathering the kind of observational intelligence that couldn't be captured in formal reports. This was how Rachel had always operated: patient, thorough, invisible until the moment action was required. The conversation at Reed's table shifted to the upcoming training cycle, discussing new candidates who would be arriving for basic underwater demolition. SEAL training. Rachel's attention sharpened as the discussion turned toward the controversial topic of female integration into SEAL teams. I heard they're pushing another wave of female candidates through in the next class. One of Reed's teammates said, his tone carrying obvious skepticism. Command is really committed to this experiment. Experiment is right, another SEAL responded. How many have actually made it through the full pipeline? 2. 3. Rachel knew the actual numbers. 5 women had successfully completed BUD/S training and earned their SEAL qualification over the past 4 years, though only 3 remained on active operational teams. The others had transitioned to other assignments after their initial contracts. She also knew that those 5 had been subjected to scrutiny and standards that their male counterparts never faced. Their every action analyzed as proof of either women's capability or unsuitability for special operations. Reed leaned back in his chair, his posture radiating the kind of casual confidence that came from proven capability and peer validation. Look, I don't have a problem with women serving. My sister's an Army officer, and she's damn good at her job. But there's a difference between most military roles and what we do. SEAL teams require a level of physical capability and mental toughness that's just biologically different for women. His statement was carefully calibrated, acknowledging female military service in general while creating an exception for elite special operations. It was the kind of argument that sounded reasonable on its surface but contained assumptions that didn't survive careful scrutiny. Rachel had heard variations of this position hundreds of times throughout her career, often from men who had never actually worked with female special operators and whose opinions were based more on theoretical concerns than empirical experience. The standards are the standards. Reed continued, warming to his subject as his teammates listened. If a woman can meet them legitimately, fine. But we can't lower the bar just to hit some Pentagon diversity quota. Lives depend on every team member being able to perform at the highest level. Rachel kept her eyes on her tablet, giving no indication she was listening to their conversation. This was exactly the kind of attitude she had been sent to document, not overt hostility or explicit discrimination, but rather a pervasive skepticism that questioned whether women could legitimately belong in SEAL teams even when they met all established standards. One of Reed's teammates glanced in Rachel's direction, noting her presence at the nearby table. "Careful, man. We got an audience," he said quietly, gesturing subtly toward where Rachel sat. Reed turned to look, his eyes taking in Rachel's rank insignia and administrative bearing with a single dismissive glance. His expression made it clear that he placed her firmly in the category of personnel who didn't understand or participate in real operational work. "It's fine," he said, his voice not quite lowered enough. "She's just another admin officer. Probably here to update our sensitivity training requirements or some shit." The comment was loud enough for Rachel to hear, clearly intentional. Reed was establishing dominance in his territory, making it clear that he didn't consider her presence significant enough to modify his conversation. It was a calculated dismissal, the kind of social power play that reinforced hierarchies and boundaries. Rachel's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her fork, years of tactical discipline preventing any visible reaction. She had endured far worse in Taliban interrogation rooms and during CRE training designed to break even the most hardened operators. A dismissive comment from an arrogant SEAL barely registered on the scale of challenges she had overcome. But she also recognized this moment for what it was, an opportunity to observe how Reed and his teammates behaved when they believed there would be no consequences for their attitudes. She continued reading her tablet, giving every appearance of being absorbed in bureaucratic documentation, while her mind catalogued every word and nuance of their continuing conversation. Reed's teammates seemed slightly uncomfortable with his pointed comment, suggesting that not everyone at the table shared his casual disregard for administrative personnel. But none of them challenged him directly, and the conversation continued in the same vein, speculating about whether female SEAL candidates could truly meet standards, questioning the motivations behind integration policies, and expressing doubts about women's place in direct combat roles. Rachel finished her meal methodically, her expression never changing from the neutral pleasantness appropriate to a mid-level officer reviewing routine documentation. When she stood to bus her tray, she moved with the unremarkable efficiency of someone focused on completing a mundane task. She passed within 10 feet of Reed's table, close enough to clearly hear his ongoing commentary about training standards and political correctness in modern military policy. As she deposited her tray in the collection area, Rachel caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the polished metal surface, a woman in her mid-30s wearing a uniform that gave no indication of the combat experience hidden beneath its pressed fabric. Her expression was calm and professional, betraying none of the calculations running through her tactical mind. She left the mess hall without incident, walking back toward her temporary quarters as the California evening deepened into night. Behind her, Reed and his teammates continued their conversation, completely unaware that the unremarkable administrative officer they had dismissed was actually one of the most highly decorated special operators currently serving in the United States military. The following morning, Rachel arrived at her office before 0600, well ahead of the official start of the workday. The compound was quiet at this hour, populated only by the most dedicated personnel and those preparing for early training evolutions. She used the solitary time to compile her observations from the previous evening into her classified report, carefully documenting the specific comments and attitudes she had witnessed. Her official schedule included several interviews with SEAL instructors and senior enlisted personnel, part of her cover mission of reviewing training protocols. These conversations gave her legitimate access to the most experienced special operators on the base, and she used each interaction to gather additional intelligence about cultural attitudes toward female integration. Master Chief Petty Officer James Cortez arrived for his 0800 interview precisely on time, his massive frame filling the doorway of Rachel's small office. He was 52 years old with 30 years of naval service, including over 2 decades in the SEAL community. His weathered face and careful movement patterns told the story of a body that had been pushed beyond normal human limits countless times. He was also, according to her background research, one of the most respected senior enlisted leaders in naval special warfare. Commander Chen, he said formally, settling into the chair across from her desk with the controlled grace of someone whose physical conditioning remained extraordinary despite his age. I understand, you're conducting a review of our training standards. That's correct, Master Chief, Rachel replied, maintaining her administrative officer persona. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I'm particularly interested in how we evaluate candidates' performance during the most demanding phases of training. For the next 40 minutes, they discussed training protocols in detail. Cortez was articulate and thoughtful, explaining the philosophy behind BUD's training and how standards had evolved over decades to identify candidates with the physical capability and mental toughness required for special operations. Rachel asked careful questions, focusing on technical details while occasionally probing for his views on recent policy changes. Master Chief, how do you assess the integration of female candidates into the SEAL pipeline? She finally asked, her tone professionally neutral. Cortez was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Ma'am, I judge people based on their performance, not their demographics. I've seen candidates who looked like they were genetically engineered for this work ring out during Hell Week. I've seen others who seemed unlikely to make it through day one go on to become exceptional operators. His answer was diplomatic but genuine. Rachel pressed slightly further. Have you observed any specific challenges related to gender integration? The Master Chief's eyes met hers with an intensity that suggested he understood she was asking about more than just training metrics. The biggest challenge isn't physical standards or combat capability. It's cultural resistance from people who think they know what a SEAL should look like based on the past century of experience. Change is hard, especially in communities built on tradition and proven methods. Rachel noted the careful phrasing. Cortez was acknowledging problems without directly accusing anyone of discrimination. And how do you address that cultural resistance? By holding everyone to the same standards and insisting on professional behavior. Cortez replied firmly. Personnel, who can't adapt to changing demographics don't belong in modern special operations, regardless of how good their tactical skills might be. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Cortez providing thoughtful insights that would be valuable for her assessment. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door and turned back, toward her. "Commander, may I speak freely for a moment?" "Of course, Master Chief. You're asking better questions than I'd expect from a routine administrative review," he said carefully. "Your background, you came up through surface warfare, right?" Rachel maintained her calm expression while her mind rapidly processed this unexpected turn. Cortez was more observant than she had anticipated, and he was probing to understand her actual background. "That's correct," she replied simply, offering no additional information. The Master Chief nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he sensed there was more to her story but respected her decision not to elaborate. "Well, ma'am, if you're trying to understand SEAL culture from the inside, you might want to spend more time in spaces where operators let their guard down. The mess hall, the PT areas, the informal gatherings, after training, that's where you'll learn what people really think." "Thank you for the advice, Master Chief," Rachel said, recognizing that Cortez had just offered her tacit approval to continue her observational mission. After he left, Rachel sat quietly for several minutes, reassessing her approach. Cortez's perceptiveness meant she needed to be even more careful about maintaining her cover. But his suggestion also validated her strategy of gathering intelligence in informal settings where authentic attitudes emerged. Over the next several days, Rachel increased her presence in common areas around the SEAL compound. She ate meals in the mess hall, worked out in the base gym during peak hours, and positioned herself in locations where she could observe team interactions without appearing to surveil anyone. She was careful to maintain her unremarkable administrative persona, but she was also documenting a comprehensive picture of cultural attitudes across the special operations community. During a lunchtime workout, Rachel found herself in the weight room at the same time as several members of SEAL Team 5, including Marcus Reed. She kept to her own routine, working through a methodical strength training session that wouldn't attract attention but maintained the physical conditioning she had fought so hard to achieve. Years of specialized training had given her a level of functional strength that surprised people who assumed her relatively compact frame indicated limited capability. Reed and his teammates occupied the far corner of the gym, cycling through a brutal workout routine that involved heavy compound lifts interspersed with high-intensity cardio. Rachel kept her focus on her own exercises, but her peripheral vision tracked their movements and conversations. At one point, Reed loaded a barbell with 225 pounds for bench press, a weight that represented serious strength for most people, but was routine for SEAL operators who maintained exceptional physical conditioning as part of their professional requirements. He completed several sets with practiced efficiency, his teammates spotting and offering encouragement. Between sets, Reed noticed Rachel working through pull-ups on a nearby bar. She was performing strict form reps without the leg swing that many people use to generate momentum, her movements controlled and precise. After completing a set of 15, she rested briefly before starting another set. "Not bad for an admin officer," Reed commented to his teammates, his voice carrying just far enough for Rachel to hear. The tone was patronizing, implying that her performance was impressive only relative to low expectations. Rachel completed her second set of pull-ups, another 15 reps with perfect form, and moved to a different exercise without acknowledging Reed's comment. She had learned long ago that engaging with this kind of provocation accomplished nothing. Competence spoke louder than words, and she had no need to prove herself to personnel who had already decided what she was capable of, based on superficial observations. One of Reed's teammates, however, seemed slightly impressed. "That's actually pretty solid pull-up form," he observed quietly. "Most officers can barely do 5. Reed shrugged dismissively. "PT standards for officers are lower than for operators. She's probably just trying to stay in shape for the desk job." Rachel moved to the rowing machine, programming it for a 2,000-meter sprint at maximum resistance. Her face remained calm and focused as she attacked the workout, her stroke rate and power output climbing to levels that suggested serious cardiovascular conditioning and technical rowing skill. The machine's display showed her maintaining a split time that would be competitive in regional rowing competitions far beyond what casual fitness enthusiasts could achieve. She finished the 2,000 meters in just under 7 minutes, her breathing heavy but controlled as she wiped down the machine and collected her gear. As she headed toward the exit, she passed close enough to Reed's group to hear his continued commentary about administrative personnel and their limited understanding of what real operational work required. Rachel maintained her expression of professional indifference. But internally, she noted every word for her report. This pattern of dismissive attitudes wasn't limited to formal training evaluations or official interactions. It permeated the social fabric of the community, creating an environment where women were perpetually viewed as outsiders regardless of their actual capabilities or qualifications. The following evening, Rachel returned to the mess hall for dinner, arriving slightly earlier than the previous week to observe personnel as they transitioned from work mode to social interaction. She collected her meal and settled at a different corner table, positioning herself with a clear view of the main seating area where SEAL teams typically gathered. Reed arrived with his usual group of teammates, their body language suggesting they had completed a particularly demanding training day. They claimed their customary table and began eating with the focused intensity of men whose bodies demanded substantial caloric intake to maintain their conditioning. Their conversation was animated, discussing the day's training evolution and making plans for the weekend. Rachel ate her own meal while ostensibly reading another training manual on her tablet, her attention divided between the document and the surrounding conversations. She was perfecting the art of appearing completely absorbed in bureaucratic work while actually conducting sophisticated social intelligence gathering. As the mess hall filled with more personnel, the ambient noise level increased, creating an auditory environment where individual conversations could occur without being overheard beyond immediate proximity. This seemed to lower some social barriers, and Rachel noticed that discussions became more candid as the evening progressed. Reed's table was discussing the upcoming deployment cycle, speculating about which teams would be assigned to various operational theaters. The conversation eventually turned to manning levels and personnel assignments, with one of his teammates mentioning that several SEAL teams were currently under strength due to injuries, retirements, and personnel transferring to other assignments. "We might get one of the new graduates from the next BUD's class," Reed said. "Command is trying to bring all the teams up to full strength before the next deployment window. Hope we don't get stuck with one of the diversity candidates." Another SEAL commented quietly. "I don't care what Command says about standards. Everyone knows there's pressure to graduate female candidates to prove the program is working." Rachel's expression never changed, but her mind cataloged this comment as particularly significant. The allegation that female candidates receive preferential treatment contradicted all available data, which actually showed female SEAL candidates were held to scrutiny that their male peers never experienced. But the persistence of this narrative suggested it was a widely believed assumption within parts of the SEAL community. Reed nodded agreement. "That's the thing nobody wants to talk about openly. The standards might be technically the same on paper, but there are 1,000 ways to give someone advantages during training. Easier duty rotations, extra recovery time, instructors who go easier on evaluation criteria. And then when they graduate, we're all supposed to pretend they earned it the exact same way everyone else did." This was pure speculation presented as fact, reflecting assumptions rather than evidence. Rachel knew from her own BUD's experience that female candidates were subjected to additional scrutiny specifically to prevent any appearance of preferential treatment. Every action was documented, every evaluation was reviewed by multiple instructors, and female graduates faced constant questions about whether they had truly earned their qualification. The system, if anything, was biased toward failing female candidates rather than providing them inappropriate advantages. But she remained silent and apparently absorbed in her reading, allowing the conversation to continue without intervention. Her mission required gathering accurate intelligence about actual attitudes, not correcting misconceptions in real time. That would come later. when her findings could inform systematic changes to training and evaluation protocols. As the evening progressed, the mess hall's population shifted, as teams finished eating and departed for various evening activities. Rachel had nearly completed her meal when Petty Officer Stevens, the young sailor who had initially shown her to her office, approached her table tentatively. "Excuse me, Commander Chen," he said politely, his posture properly respectful. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner, but there's a question about one of 10, the training evaluations you requested. Do you have a moment?" Rachel set down her tablet and gave Stevens her full attention. "Of course, Petty Officer. What's the issue?" Stevens explained a minor administrative problem regarding access to certain classified training records, his description professional and clear. Rachel appreciated his competence. He was good at his job despite being relegated to support functions that most SEAL operators considered beneath their attention. As they discussed the solution, she noticed Reed glancing their direction with obvious curiosity about what the administrative officer and her assistant were discussing so seriously. After resolving the issue and dismissing Stevens with thanks, Rachel gathered her dinner tray and stood to leave. She passed relatively close to Reed's table, close enough to clearly hear one final comment that he apparently intended for his teammates but delivered at a volume that suggested he didn't care who else might overhear. "That's the problem with modern military policy," Reed said, his tone carrying the confidence of someone stating an obvious truth. "We're spending more time on administrative bullshit and diversity initiatives than on actual warfighting capabilities. That commander probably has zero operational experience, but she's here evaluating training standards for the most elite combat unit in the world. It's bureaucratic nonsense that puts everyone at risk." Rachel paused for just a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible hesitation that no one noticed. Then she continued to the tray collection area, deposited her dishes, and walked calmly toward the exit. Her face showed none of the calculations running through her mind as she processed Reed's latest dismissive comments and began formulating how this confrontation would eventually need to be addressed. Behind her, Marcus Reed continued his conversation with his teammates, completely unaware that the administrative officer he had just dismissed had earned her SEAL Trident through the same brutal training he had completed, had conducted operations in hostile territories he had only read about in classified reports, and possessed a combat record that would make his own impressive achievements look ordinary by comparison. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary within the SEAL community, a moment when assumptions would collide with reality, and casual disrespect would meet professional consequences. The San Diego morning arrived with unusual cloud cover, a marine layer that had rolled in overnight and refused to burn off despite the climbing sun. Rachel had been awake since 0430, working through the latest batch of training evaluations in her temporary quarters before heading to her office. The rhythms of the SEAL compound were becoming familiar: the early morning PT formations, the sound of teams heading to training areas, the constant hum of activity that marked a facility dedicated to producing and maintaining the world's premier special operations force. She had just settled at her desk with fresh coffee when Petty Officer Stevens appeared in her doorway, his expression tight with concern. "Commander Chen, we have a situation developing. The XO is requesting all available officers report to the command center immediately." Rachel stood without hesitation, her body shifting automatically into operational mode despite maintaining her administrative cover. "What's the nature of the emergency?" "Training evolution gone wrong, ma'am. SEAL Team 5 was running a live-fire maritime interdiction exercise off Point Loma. One of their rigid hull inflatable boats took damage from rough seas, and they have personnel in the water. Communication with the team is intermittent, something about equipment failure. They're scrambling SAR assets now." SEAL Team 5. Marcus Reed's unit. Rachel felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded crisis situations, her mind immediately shifting into tactical assessment mode. Maritime interdiction exercises were inherently dangerous, combining fast-moving boats, live ammunition, unpredictable ocean conditions, and complex coordination requirements. Equipment failure during such operations could rapidly escalate from inconvenience to life-threatening emergency. She followed Stevens toward the command center, her pace quick but controlled. Other personnel were converging on the building from various directions, their faces showing the heightened alertness that came with real-world emergencies. The SEAL community trained for disasters constantly, but when actual crises emerged, the stakes became brutally real. The command center was housed in a secure facility at the heart of the compound, a modern space filled with communication equipment, large displays showing real-time tactical information, and workstations where personnel could coordinate complex operations. When Rachel entered, she found controlled chaos, multiple officers and senior enlisted personnel coordinating rescue efforts while trying to establish clear communication with the team in distress. Lieutenant Commander Brooks, the commanding officer of SEAL Team 5, stood near the main display screen, his jaw tight with stress as he spoke rapidly into a headset. "Say again." "Ghost 2-1. You have 3 personnel in the water and your secondary boat is taking on water?" "Copy. SAR helicopter is inbound. ETA 12 minutes. Can you maintain your position?" Static crackled through the speakers, followed by a broken transmission that was barely intelligible. "Negative on holding position. Current pulling us toward shipping lanes. Primary RHIB sinking. Attempting to establish emergency beacon." The Memberson situation was deteriorating rapidly. Rachel moved to a position where she could observe the displays without interfering with ongoing operations. The main screen showed a tactical map of the Point Loma training area, with GPS markers indicating the approximate position of Team 5's boats. The ocean conditions were listed as moderate to rough 6-foot swells with gusty winds, challenging but normally within acceptable parameters for SEAL maritime operations. Captain William Harrison, the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 1, stood at the center of the command center, his silver hair and weathered face reflecting 3 decades of military experience. He was coordinating multiple response elements: the SAR helicopter, a Coast Guard vessel that had been diverted to assist, and a backup SEAL team preparing to deploy if the situation required additional personnel in the water. "Where's my SAR bird?" Harrison demanded, his voice carrying the controlled intensity of a commander, managing a crisis where lives hung in the balance. 7 minutes out, sir." A junior officer responded from a communication console. "Coast Guard vessel is 15 minutes. The backup SEAL team is ready to deploy, but we need clearer information about what they're dealing with." Another burst of static came through the speakers, this time slightly clearer. "Ghost 2-1. To command. We've got a man down. The possible spinal injury from the boat impact. Can not safely extract him without stabilization. My medic is in the other boat." The situation had just escalated from dangerous to critical. A potential spinal injury required careful extraction to prevent permanent paralysis. But rough seas and a sinking boat created a time-sensitive dilemma. Moving the injured SEAL without proper stabilization could cause devastating damage, but leaving him in a rapidly sinking vessel guaranteed worse outcomes. Rachel watched the displays intently, her mind automatically running through tactical options and risk assessments. She had trained for exactly these scenarios during her time with SEAL teams, had conducted countless maritime operations in challenging conditions, and had managed medical emergencies in hostile environments where ideal procedures were impossible to implement. Lieutenant Commander Brooks was speaking rapidly with his team lead, trying to gather enough information to make informed decisions. "Ghost 2-1. Can you describe the nature of the injuries? Is he conscious? Any obvious trauma beyond possible spinal involvement?" The response came fragmented by static and wind noise. "Conscious and alert. No visible bleeding. Took a hard impact when the boat came down off a wave. Neck and back pain. We've got him partially proctem. Immobilized, but the boat is listing badly." Captain Harrison turned to his senior medical officer, a Navy doctor who specialized in trauma response. "Commander Wilson, what's your assessment? Can they safely move him, Or do we need to risk keeping him in that boat until SAR arrives? Commander Wilson's face was grim. Sir, without knowing the specific nature of the spinal injury, moving him improperly could result in permanent paralysis. But if that boat sinks before SAR arrives and he's not properly secured, he could drown or suffer additional trauma. It's a terrible choice either way. Rachel stepped forward slightly, her movement drawing Captain Harrison's attention. He glanced at her rank insignia and administrative bearing, clearly wondering why a personnel officer was in his command center during a tactical emergency. Commander Chen, correct? He said briskly, his tone professionally dismissive. Unless you have specific expertise relevant to this situation, I'm going to need you to clear this space. We have limited room, and this is an active rescue operation. Rachel met his eyes steadily, making a split-second decision that would blow her carefully maintained cover but might save lives. Sir, I have direct experience with maritime casualty extraction in rough seas and field trauma stabilization. If you'll allow me to review the tactical situation, I may be able to provide relevant guidance. Harrison's expression showed surprise mixed with skepticism. An administrative officer, claiming relevant operational experience, was unexpected enough to give him pause. What's your background, Commander? If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one. Before Rachel could respond, another urgent transmission came through the speakers. Command. Ghost 2-1. Secondary boat is taking on serious water now. We're going to have to abandon and consolidate everyone onto the remaining RHIB. But I don't know if it can safely hold everyone plus the injured man in these seas. The crisis was accelerating. Captain Harrison made a command decision, turning back to Rachel with narrowed eyes. Commander, if you actually have relevant experience, I need your input now. Lives are on the line, and I don't have time for bureaucratic credentials. Can you help or not? Rachel moved to the tactical display, her demeanor shifting visibly from administrative observer to operational specialist. She studied the GPS positions, the ocean current data, the distance to the SAR helicopter's approach vector, and the Coast Guard vessel's intercept course. Her mind processed the information with the speed of someone who had made life-or-death tactical decisions under pressure countless times before. Sir, the current is pulling them toward the shipping lanes at approximately 2 knots, she said, her voice taking on the crisp precision of tactical briefing mode. SAR helicopter arrival in 6 minutes means the team will have drifted approximately 200 meters from their current position by the time extraction can begin. That puts them dangerously close to commercial traffic lanes. She pointed to the display, tracing movement patterns, with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with this particular area's maritime characteristics. Point Loma's offshore currents create a convergence zone approximately 300 meters west of their current position. If they drift into that zone, the sea state increases significantly, and helicopter extraction becomes much more dangerous. Lieutenant Commander Brooks had turned from his communication console to stare at Rachel with open surprise. The technical accuracy and operational fluency of her analysis was completely inconsistent with her supposed administrative background. Several other officers in the command center had also paused to listen, recognizing that her assessment demonstrated genuine expertise. Captain Harrison studied her intently, clearly reassessing his initial assumptions. Continue. Commander, what's your recommendation? Rachel's focus remained on the tactical display, her mind running through multiple scenarios and their probable outcomes. The team needs to immediately deploy all available flotation devices and establish a defensive cluster formation to prevent personnel separation. The injured SEAL should be placed on the most stable flotation platform available, secured with whatever straps or rope they have. It's not ideal medical protocol, but drowning is a more immediate threat than spinal injury at this point. She traced the SAR helicopter's approach vector. The helo should adjust its approach to account for the drift and the current. Coming in from the southwest instead of directly from the east will give them better position relative to where the team will actually be when they arrive. And it keeps them clear of the convergence zone. Commander Wilson, the medical officer, was nodding slowly, his expression showing professional respect for Rachel's analysis. That's actually solid tactical medicine. Prioritize the immediate life threat while minimizing additional risk to the existing injury. Rachel continued, her voice steady and authoritative. Ghost 2-1 needs to establish visual signal capability with the helo immediately. If their radio communication is compromised, they'll need backup methods to coordinate extraction. Do they have flares, smoke, anything that can provide visual reference in these conditions? Lieutenant Commander Brooks relayed the question to his team lead, and after a moment received confirmation that they had emergency flares and signal mirrors. The conversation in the command center had shifted noticeably. Rachel was no longer being tolerated as a bureaucratic observer but was actively contributing to the operational response. Captain Harrison made a quick decision. Commander Chen, coordinate with Lieutenant Commander Brooks. Get that team properly positioned for extraction and make sure the SAR crew understands the approach modifications. He turned to the communication console. And get me a detailed background check on Commander Chen. I want to know where she learned maritime special operations tactics. Rachel moved to Brooks' communication station, her movements efficient and purposeful. The administrative officer persona had been completely replaced by the tactical operator she actually was, though her SEAL qualification remained undisclosed. Brooks handed her a headset, his expression showing confusion mixed with growing respect. Ghost 2-1. This is command. Rachel transmitted, her voice carrying the calm authority that inspired confidence during emergencies. Listen carefully. I need you to immediately deploy all flotation devices and establish a defensive cluster with all personnel maintaining physical contact. Place your injured man on the most stable platform you have and secure him with all available restraints. The response came back, clearer now. Command, Ghost 2-1, actual. Who am I talking to? That's not the XO's voice. Ghost 2-1. This is Commander Chen. My background is not relevant right now. What matters is getting your people extracted safely. Do you have emergency flares and signal capability for visual coordination with the SAR bird? There was a brief pause. Then the team leader's voice came back with notable urgency. Affirmative on flares and signals. Ma'am, with respect, I need to know who's giving me tactical direction right now. My men's lives are on the line. Rachel understood his concern. SEAL operators were trained to question unexpected voices in their chain of command, especially during crisis situations. Trust was earned through demonstrated competence and verified credentials, not blind obedience to unfamiliar authority. Ghost 2-1. Your XO is standing next to me and can verify. Right now, I need you to trust that I know exactly what you're dealing with because I've been in similar situations. Execute the clustering formation, prepare your visual signals, and stand by for modified SAR approach vectors. We're going to get everyone home safely. Lieutenant Commander Brooks leaned toward his microphone. Ghost 2-1. This is Brooks. Execute Commander Chen's instructions. She knows what she's talking about. The team leader's voice came back with acknowledgement, and Rachel could hear the sounds of urgent activity in the background as the SEALs in the water implemented her directions. She coordinated with the SAR helicopter crew, explaining the modified approach vector and the reasoning behind it. The helicopter pilot, an experienced naval aviator with hundreds of rescue missions under his belt, immediately recognized the tactical soundness of her recommendations. Command. This is Rescue 3-1. That's a solid call on the approach modification. We'll come in from the southwest and adjust for the current drift. ETA now 4 minutes. Rachel maintained her position at the communication console, providing steady guidance as the rescue operation unfolded. She coordinated visual signal timing with the team in the water, ensured the SAR crew understood the specific medical concerns with the injured SEAL, and monitored the overall tactical situation for any emerging complications. The tension in the command center was palpable as everyone focused on the displays and radio communications. Captain Harrison stood nearby, watching Rachel's performance with an expression that mixed approval with deep curiosity about where this supposed administrative officer had acquired such obvious operational experience. Ghost 2-1. Command. SAR bird is 2 minutes out. Prepare to pop smoke on my mark. The helo will be coming from your southwest, so orient your visual signals accordingly. Command. Ghost 2-1. Ready for smoke deployment. Ma'am, whoever you are, this is damn good coordination. We're in good shape down here considering the circumstances. Rachel felt a slight smile touch her lips, the first crack in her professional composure. SEAL operators gave respect grudgingly and only when it was earned. The team leader's acknowledgement meant her tactical guidance had been accurate and helpful. Ghost 2-1. Mark smoke now. Through the radio, she could hear the whoosh of the emergency flare igniting, followed by the growing sound of helicopter rotors as Rescue 3-1 approached the extraction point. The SAR crew's communications were crisp and professional as they positioned for pickup, their voices showing the particular focus that came with dangerous aerial work in challenging conditions. Rescue 3-1 has visual on smoke. We see 6 personnel in the water, clustered formation with 1 on a flotation platform, preparing for extraction. Priority on the injured man. Deploying rescue swimmer now. The command center fell silent, except for the radio communications as everyone monitored the extraction process. The SAR helicopter's crew was executing a textbook rescue operation, the helicopter pilot holding steady position despite gusty winds, the rescue swimmer entering the water with practiced efficiency, the careful coordination as they prepared to lift the injured SEAL first. First patient is secured and lifting. The helicopter crew reported. Extraction basket is coming back down for second personnel. Rachel maintained her focus on the tactical display, monitoring the team's position relative to the convergence zone and the approaching Coast Guard vessel. The extraction was proceeding smoothly, each SEAL being lifted from the water in turn while the rescue swimmer ensured safe transfer into the helicopter's hoist system. Final personnel extracted. All 6 SEALs are aboard. Rescue 3-1 is returning to base. Medical personnel standing by for trauma evaluation on the spinal injury patient. The tension in the command center released like a held breath, with several officers allowing themselves visible relief. The immediate crisis had been resolved successfully, all personnel recovered, the injured SEAL receiving medical attention, and the team safely extracted before conditions could deteriorate further. Captain Harrison turned to face Rachel directly, his expression showing professional respect mixed with unmistakable curiosity. Commander Chen, that was exceptional crisis coordination. Your tactical guidance was precise, and your understanding of maritime special operations was clearly based on direct experience, not administrative review of training manuals. Around the command center, other officers were studying Rachel with new interest, clearly reassessing their initial impressions of the quiet administrative officer who had been working in their compound for the past 2 weeks. Lieutenant Commander Brooks in particular was staring at her with an expression that suggested he was beginning to suspect there was much more to her background than her personnel file indicated. "Sir, I'm glad we could get the team extracted safely," Rachel replied, maintaining professional neutrality despite knowing that her cover was now effectively blown. There was no way to explain the level of tactical expertise she had just demonstrated without revealing at least some of her actual background. Section 5. The recognition begins. Captain Harrison gestured toward his office, a private space adjacent to the command center. "Commander, I think we need to have a conversation about exactly who you are and what you're really doing on my base. Your performance just now was not consistent with a personnel officer conducting routine administrative reviews." Rachel followed him into the office, aware that every eye in the command center was tracking her movement. She had known from the moment she chose to intervene that maintaining her cover would become impossible, but saving lives had taken priority over maintaining operational security. Now she would need to decide how much to reveal and when. Harrison closed the door and gestured for Rachel to sit, his demeanor remaining professional but clearly demanding answers. "I've been in naval special warfare for 28 years, Commander. I know what operational experience looks like, and you just demonstrated tactical expertise that doesn't come from reading training manuals or conducting administrative reviews. So I'll ask you directly, what's your actual background?" Rachel met his eyes steadily, making a calculated decision about disclosure. "Sir, I'm conducting an evaluation mission for Naval Special Warfare Command. The administrative review was my cover for observing actual cultural dynamics and operational attitudes within SEAL teams. My real background includes operational experience that qualified me to conduct this assessment." Harrison's expression hardened slightly. "That's bureaucratic speak for, I'm not going to give you a straight answer. Commander, you just saved the lives of men under my command. You've earned the right to honesty in return. I want to know specifically where you learned maritime special operations tactics at the level you just demonstrated." Before Rachel could respond, there was a sharp knock on the office door. Lieutenant Commander Brooks entered without waiting for permission, his face showing barely contained urgency. "Sir, I apologize for interrupting, but I just received the personnel file you requested on Commander Chen. I think you need to see this immediately." Brooks handed Harrison a tablet displaying Rachel's complete service record, not the sanitized version that had been provided for her administrative cover, but her actual classified personnel file that documented her full career history. Harrison's eyes widened as he read, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock to something approaching awe. "You're SEAL qualified," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "You graduated BUD/S 4 years ago, top 10% of your class. 2 combat deployments with SEAL Team 3. Multiple commendations for operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Classified missions that I apparently don't have clearance to review." He looked up from the tablet to stare at Rachel directly. "You're one of the first female Navy SEALs. And you've been operating here under administrative cover for 2 weeks, while my command had no idea who you actually were." Brooks was staring at Rachel with an expression that combined shock, admiration, and perhaps a touch of embarrassment. "Ma'am, the entire command has been treating you like a routine personnel officer. If you had known, Lieutenant Commander, my evaluation mission would have been compromised." Rachel interrupted gently. The point was to observe authentic attitudes and behaviors when personnel believed no one of consequence was watching. That required maintaining an unremarkable cover. Harrison set down the tablet and leaned back in his chair, his mind clearly processing this revelation and its implications. "The rumors about cultural resistance to female integration, that's what you were sent to investigate. And the Pentagon wanted an actual female SEAL to conduct the assessment because only someone with that background would understand what they were observing." "That's correct, sir," Rachel confirmed, recognizing that full disclosure was now necessary and potentially beneficial. "I've been documenting attitudes, behaviors, and cultural dynamics across the SEAL community here at Coronado. My mission was to provide Naval Special Warfare Command with accurate intelligence about how female integration is actually progressing versus what official reports indicate." Brooks shifted uncomfortably, perhaps thinking about conversations he had participated in or overheard over the past 2 weeks. "Ma'am, if you've been observing team interactions, what have you found?" Rachel considered her response carefully. "I've found that most SEAL operators are professional and focused on mission effectiveness. I've also found that a significant minority harbor assumptions about female capabilities that aren't based on empirical evidence or actual experience working with female special operators. Those assumptions create cultural barriers that affect unit cohesion and potentially compromise operational effectiveness." Harrison nodded slowly, his expression showing the thoughtful consideration of a senior leader confronting uncomfortable truths. "And you've documented specific examples of this resistance?" "Extensively, sir, including conversations in the mess hall, comments during PT sessions, and explicit statements questioning whether female SEALs could legitimately meet standards without receiving inappropriate advantages during training." The office fell silent as both men processed the implications of Rachel's assessment. Brooks in particular seemed troubled, perhaps recognizing that his own unit had been the subject of significant observation and documentation. "Sir, there's something else you should know," Brooks said carefully, turning to Captain Harrison. Team 5 was involved in several of the incidents Commander Chen is probably referencing. Specifically, Petty Officer Reed has made multiple comments questioning female integration, including statements in the mess hall that Commander Chen was likely in position to overhear. Harrison's expression darkened. "Reed? The same SEAL who was just extracted from the water thanks to Commander Chen's tactical expertise?" "Yes, sir. And he has no idea that the administrative officer he's been dismissive of for 2 weeks is actually a SEAL who outranks him and has a more extensive combat record than most of our operators." A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Petty Officer Stevens appeared, his expression apologetic. "Sir, sorry to interrupt, but the SAR helicopter has landed. All 6 SEALs have been transported to medical for evaluation. The injured man appears to have a severe muscle strain rather than spinal injury, painful but not permanently debilitating. Everyone else is in good condition considering the circumstances." Harrison nodded with visible relief. "Thank you. Stevens, please inform the team that I'll be conducting a debrief once medical clears them for duty." As Stevens departed, Harrison turned back to Rachel with an expression of genuine respect. "Commander, your tactical coordination during that rescue was exceptional. You potentially saved lives, certainly prevented injuries, and demonstrated exactly the kind of operational competence that should put to rest any questions about female capabilities in special operations roles." "Thank you, sir. But I was just applying standard tactical procedures to a crisis situation. Any SEAL with maritime operations experience would have provided similar guidance." "Perhaps," Harrison acknowledged, "but you did it while maintaining composure and providing clear direction under pressure. That's leadership, Commander. And it's going to make your evaluation report significantly more impactful when the individuals you've been documenting realize that you're not just a bureaucratic observer, but an actual operator who has proven herself in the same crucible they endured." Rachel recognized the strategic opportunity that had emerged from the crisis. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to complete my evaluation mission before revealing my full background to the broader SEAL community. Today's incident will certainly raise questions, but I can maintain plausible deniability about my SEAL qualification for a few more days while I finish documentation." Harrison considered this request thoughtfully. "You want to see how personnel react when they learn you have operational expertise, but before they understand you're actually SEAL qualified. That could provide valuable data about how they distinguish between general military competence and the specific credibility that comes from being a SEAL." "Exactly, sir. The reactions will reveal a lot about underlying attitudes and assumptions." Brooks spoke up carefully. "Ma'am, with respect, maintaining any kind of cover after what just happened will be extremely difficult. The entire command center witnessed your performance. Personnel will be talking about the administrative officer who coordinated the rescue operation with tactical precision. Questions will be asked." "I understand, Lieutenant Commander. But I'm not trying to maintain complete cover, just delay full disclosure for a few more days while I observe how people respond to partial revelations. It's the difference between she has some operational experience and she's actually a SEAL. That distinction will generate different reactions that are valuable for my assessment." Harrison made a command decision. "Approved, Commander. I'll ensure personnel in this command center understand that the details of your background remain classified for operational reasons. You'll have your few additional days. But after that, I want a complete debrief about your findings, and I want to be present when the full truth is revealed to the personnel you've been documenting, particularly Petty Officer Reed." A slight smile touched Rachel's lips. "I think that can be arranged, sir. In fact, I believe the mess hall would be an appropriate venue for that particular revelation, given how many significant conversations have occurred there over the past 2 weeks." Word of the dramatic rescue coordination spread through the SEAL compound, with the speed of special operations gossip networks, which is to say, nearly instantaneously. By lunchtime, the story had evolved into multiple versions, each emphasizing different aspects of the morning's events. The common thread in all versions was that the quiet administrative officer everyone had ignored had somehow demonstrated tactical expertise that had contributed to successfully extracting Team 5 from a dangerous situation. Rachel returned to her office to find several curious glances from passing personnel, their expressions showing newfound interest in the woman they had previously dismissed as bureaucratically irrelevant. She maintained her professional demeanor, offering polite nods but no elaboration about her background or the morning's events. Master Chief Cortez appeared in her doorway mid-afternoon, his weathered face showing an expression that suggested he had suspected there was more to her story all along. "Commander Chen, may I have a word?" "Of course, Master Chief. Please come in." Cortez closed the door behind him and settled into the chair across from her desk, with the careful deliberation of someone choosing his words precisely. "Ma'am, I've been hearing interesting stories about what happened in the command center this morning. Multiple reliable sources tell me you coordinated the Team 5 extraction with tactical precision that was unexpected." From someone conducting an administrative review, Rachel met his eyes steadily, recognizing that Cortez's perceptiveness had already led him close to the truth. "Master Chief, I provided guidance based on my background and training. The situation required someone with relevant experience, and I was in position to assist." "That's a diplomatic answer, ma'am," Cortez said with a slight smile. "But I've been in this community long enough to recognize when I'm being given the official version versus the complete truth. Your guidance included specific knowledge of Point Loma's offshore currents, tactical medicine protocols for spinal injuries in maritime environments, and SAR helicopter coordination procedures. That's not knowledge you acquire from reviewing training manuals." He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "Commander, I've served with some of the best operators in naval special warfare history. I know what real operational experience looks like. And what you demonstrated this morning was genuine tactical competence, not administrative familiarity with procedures. So I'm going to ask you directly. Knowing you may not be authorized to answer, are you here conducting an actual evaluation of how we treat female operators?" Rachel considered her response carefully, recognizing that Cortez had earned honest engagement through his years of service and his obvious commitment to professional standards. "Master Chief, if I were conducting such an evaluation, would you consider that mission necessary?" Cortez's expression showed appreciation for her careful non-denial. "Ma'am, I would consider it absolutely necessary. Because despite what official reports might say, there are significant cultural issues in how some personnel view female integration into SEAL teams. Those issues don't always rise to the level of formal complaints or disciplinary actions, but they create an environment that makes success unnecessarily difficult for qualified women. And if such an evaluation were happening, what would you hope to see as outcomes? Honest assessment of who genuinely supports professional standards versus who's operating from prejudice or outdated assumptions," Cortez replied firmly. "And consequences for personnel whose attitudes compromise unit cohesion or operational effectiveness, regardless of how good their tactical skills might be. We can't afford to maintain operators who create division within teams, even if those operators are otherwise competent." Rachel nodded slowly, making a decision about partial disclosure. "Master Chief, I appreciate your insight and your commitment to professional standards. When my evaluation is complete and findings are presented, I hope you'll be part of the discussion about implementing necessary changes." Cortez stood, reading between the lines of her carefully worded response. "Ma'am, I look forward to that discussion. And for what it's worth, I hope whoever you really are, and whatever your actual mission might be, I hope the truth comes out in a way that makes the biggest impact possible. Some people around here need to have their assumptions challenged directly." After Cortez departed, Rachel spent the afternoon completing her documentation while monitoring the ongoing conversations throughout the compound. The partial revelation of her capabilities had created exactly the reaction she had anticipated, curiosity mixed with confusion about how an administrative officer could possess obvious operational expertise. That evening, she returned to the mess hall for dinner, aware that her presence would now attract more attention than during previous visits. She collected her meal and deliberately chose a table with good visibility to most of the dining area, positioning herself where conversations could be observed while remaining somewhat separated from the main social clusters. SEAL Team 5 arrived approximately 30 minutes into the dinner service, all 6 members who had been involved in the morning's incident walking together. They had been cleared by medical and released to return to duty, though the operator who had suffered the back injury was moving carefully and wearing a support brace. The team's body language showed the particular relief that came after surviving a dangerous situation. They were more animated than usual, clearly processing the day's events through the lens of men who understood how close they had come to serious injury or death. Marcus Reed was among them, his expression thoughtful rather than displaying his usual confident swagger. The experience of being in genuine danger, facing equipment failure in rough seas, and requiring emergency extraction had clearly affected him, as such experiences affected all operators who survived situations where outcomes could have been tragically different. The team claimed their customary table, but Rachel noticed several of them glancing in her direction with expressions that mixed curiosity and something approaching respect. The morning's events had shifted their perception of her, even though they didn't yet understand the full scope of her background. After several minutes of conversation at their table, Reed stood and walked deliberately toward where Rachel sat. His approach was cautious rather than aggressive, his body language suggesting he was genuinely uncertain about how to navigate this interaction. He stopped a respectful distance from her table and cleared his throat politely. "Commander Chen, may I speak with you for a moment?" Rachel looked up from her tablet, her expression professionally neutral. "Of course, Petty Officer Reed. Please sit down." Reed settled into the chair across from her, his posture showing none of the casual confidence he had displayed during their previous proximate encounters. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you personally for the tactical coordination this morning. My team leader briefed us on what happened in the command center, and it's clear your guidance contributed to getting us extracted safely. I was glad to help, Petty Officer. The SAR crew did the difficult work, I just provided coordination support." Reed shook his head slightly. "Ma'am, with respect, multiple people who were in that command center told me you did more than coordination support. They said you demonstrated tactical expertise with maritime special operations that was unexpected from someone conducting administrative reviews." Rachel maintained her calm expression, recognizing this as the opening she had been waiting for. Rechanstedov reported toward calm. "Sometimes people's backgrounds are more complex than their current assignments might suggest. Petty Officer, I'm beginning to understand that, ma'am," Reed said carefully. "And I'm also beginning to realize that I may have made assumptions about you over the past 2 weeks that were not based on accurate information about your experience or capabilities." It was as close to an apology as he could manage without knowing the full truth about who she actually was. Rachel appreciated the attempt at acknowledging his mistake, even though he still didn't understand the complete magnitude of his misconceptions. "Petty Officer Reed, assumptions are natural when we encounter people whose backgrounds we don't fully understand. What matters is how quickly we're willing to adjust our perspectives when presented with new information." Reed nodded, clearly processing this observation and its implications. "Ma'am, may I ask, and I understand if you can't answer, but where did you learn maritime special operations tactics? Because what you did this morning wasn't administrative knowledge. That was operational experience." Before Rachel could respond, Master Chief Cortez approached their table, his timing suggesting he had been observing their conversation and had chosen this specific moment to intervene. "Petty Officer Reed, perhaps you should ask yourself why you're so surprised that Commander Chen has operational experience. What assumptions led you to believe she was just an administrative officer?" Reed's face flushed slightly, as he recognized the implicit criticism in Cortez's question. Master Chief, I made judgments based on her current assignment and the fact that she was conducting training reviews. I didn't consider that her background might include actual operational service. And why didn't you consider that possibility? Cortez pressed, his tone remaining professional but carrying unmistakable challenge. Was it because of her rank? Her apparent role? Or perhaps other factors that influenced your assumptions about what she was capable of? The question hung in the air, forcing Reed to confront the gender-based assumptions that had shaped his perception of Rachel from their first indirect encounter. Other personnel in the mess hall had noticed the conversation, and several were watching with clear interest in how this exchange would unfold. Rachel intervened before the confrontation could escalate further. Master Chief, Petty Officer Reed came over to express his thanks for this morning's support. I appreciate his acknowledgement, and I understand that sometimes our initial impressions of people turn out to be incomplete. Cortez nodded slowly but maintained his focus on Reed. Petty Officer, over my 30 years in this community, I've learned that the most dangerous mistakes are the ones we make about our own teammates. Underestimating someone's capabilities because they don't fit our preconceived notions of what a warrior looks like, that's how people get hurt or killed in operational environments. Reed absorbed this criticism with visible discomfort, recognizing that the respected Master Chief was delivering a lesson that went beyond the immediate situation. Master Chief, I understand. And ma'am, he turned back to Rachel, I hope you'll accept my sincere appreciation for what you did this morning, regardless of how my previous assumptions may have affected my behavior over the past 2 weeks. Thank you, Petty Officer. Your acknowledgement is appreciated. Reed stood and returned to his team's table, where his teammates were clearly curious about what had just transpired. Rachel watched as animated conversations began at several tables, personnel discussing the morning's events and speculating about Commander Chen's actual background and qualifications. Master Chief Cortez remained standing near Rachel's table, a slight smile on his weathered face. Ma'am, I suspect the next few days are going to be very interesting around here. Personnel are starting to ask the right questions, even if they haven't figured out the complete answers yet. I suspect you're correct, Master Chief. Sometimes, the process of discovery is as valuable as the final revelation. As the evening progressed, Rachel observed the subtle shifts in how personnel throughout the mess hall were interacting with her presence. The casual dismissiveness that had characterized previous visits had been replaced by cautious curiosity and nascent respect. She had moved from invisible to notable, from ignorable to relevant, though the full truth about her SEAL qualification remained concealed. The stage was now set for the final confrontation that would complete her evaluation mission and potentially transform cultural attitudes within the SEAL community at Coronado. The question was no longer whether her true identity would be revealed, but rather when and how that revelation would occur to create maximum impact on the personnel whose attitudes she had been documenting for 2 weeks. Marcus Reed returned to his teammates, troubled by his conversation with Commander Chen and Master Chief Cortez's pointed observations. As he rejoined their table, the other members of Team 5 looked at him expectantly, clearly wanting to know what had been discussed. Well? Asked Tommy Chen, one of Reed's closest teammates. What did she say? Does she have some kind of special operations background? Reed shook his head slowly. She didn't give me a direct answer, but the implication was pretty clear that her background is more complex than her current administrative assignment suggests. And Cortez basically called me out for making assumptions about her capabilities based on incomplete information. The team fell silent for a moment, processing this revelation and its implications. Another SEAL, Jake Morrison, spoke up thoughtfully. You know, looking back on the past 2 weeks, there were signs we all missed. The way she moves, it's not like typical administrative officers. She's always aware of her surroundings, always positioned where she can observe without being noticed. That's operational tradecraft, not bureaucratic behavior. And remember when we saw her doing pull-ups in the gym? Another teammate added. That wasn't casual fitness. She was training with purpose, maintaining conditioning for something specific. Reed felt a growing sense of unease as his teammates identified observations that should have triggered his awareness but had been dismissed because of his preconceived assumptions about what an administrative officer would be capable of. The possibility was beginning to emerge that Commander Chen was not just someone with some operational experience, but rather someone with significant special operations background who had been deliberately concealing her true qualifications. How many female officers do you know who can coordinate maritime special operations rescues with that level of tactical precision? Morrison asked quietly, voicing the question that was beginning to trouble all of them. And how many of those officers would be conducting training reviews at SEAL facilities? The implications were becoming uncomfortably clear, though none of them were quite ready to voice the possibility that seemed increasingly likely. Could Commander Chen actually be one of the female SEALs they had heard about but never met? And if so, what did that mean for the conversations they had participated in or overheard over the past 2 weeks, conversations that had questioned whether women could legitimately meet SEAL standards? Reed's discomfort intensified as he remembered specific comments he had made, including his dismissive statement in this very mess hall just days earlier about administrative officers who had zero operational experience conducting training evaluations. If Commander Chen was actually SEAL qualified, then his arrogant dismissal had been directed at someone whose operational credentials likely exceeded his own. Across the mess hall, Rachel continued her meal while observing these reactions with tactical patience. The seeds of recognition were being planted, creating the conditions for maximum impact when the full truth was finally revealed. Her evaluation mission was entering its final phase, and the confrontation that would define its conclusion was rapidly approaching. The following Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the marine layer having burned off early to reveal the kind of perfect Southern California sky that made Coronado feel like a postcard. Rachel had spent the weekend finalizing her evaluation report, compiling 2 weeks of detailed observations, documented conversations, and analyzed cultural patterns into a comprehensive assessment that would inform Naval Special Warfare Command's policies on female integration into SEAL teams. Captain Harrison had scheduled a mandatory all-hands meeting for 0900 hours, ostensibly to discuss upcoming training cycles and deployment rotations. What most personnel didn't know was that this meeting would also serve as the venue for revealing Commander Chen's true identity and presenting preliminary findings from her evaluation mission. The timing had been carefully chosen Monday morning, when all SEAL teams would be present, in a setting formal enough to emphasize the seriousness of the discussion but open enough to allow authentic reactions. Rachel dressed in her standard Navy working uniform, but this time she added the elements that identified her SEAL qualification. The gold trident pin, officially the Special Warfare insignia, was positioned precisely above her ribbons, its distinctive eagle clutching an anchor, trident, and flintlock pistol immediately identifying her as a qualified member of the Naval Special Warfare community. The weight of the pin was familiar and comforting, a physical reminder of everything she had endured and achieved to earn the right to wear it. She also wore her combat ribbons in their complete arrangement, no longer displaying only the minimal decorations appropriate for an administrative cover. The Navy Cross sat prominently, among them the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded for her actions during a classified operation in Afghanistan, where she had single-handedly held off enemy fighters while her team evacuated wounded personnel. Few SEALs earned the Navy Cross during their entire careers. Rachel had received hers during her first combat deployment. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not the unremarkable administrative officer who had moved through the compound for 2 weeks, but rather Commander Rachel Phantom Chen, a decorated combat veteran whose operational record spoke louder than any verbal defense of female capability in special operations could ever achieve. The auditorium where the all-hands meeting would be held was the largest gathering space on the compound, capable of accommodating several hundred personnel in tiered seating that provided good sightlines to the stage area. As Rachel walked toward the building, she noticed personnel doing double takes as they registered the SEAL trident on her uniform. the first visible indication that the quiet administrative officer was something far more significant than anyone had realized. Petty Officer Stevens, who had served as her administrative assistant during the evaluation, actually stopped walking mid-stride when he saw her approaching. His eyes locked onto the trident, then traveled up to her face with an expression of absolute shock. "Ma'am, you're actually a SEAL?" Rachel offered him a slight smile. "I am, Petty Officer. Have been for 4 years. Though I appreciate you maintaining my administrative cover during the evaluation period." "Ma'am, I had no idea. None of us did." "You've been..." He struggled to find words. "You've been here for 2 weeks, and nobody suspected you were SEAL qualified? That was rather the point of an undercover evaluation, Petty Officer. If everyone had known who I was, they would have modified their behavior, and I wouldn't have observed authentic cultural dynamics." Stevens shook his head in disbelief. "Ma'am, with respect, when people find out about this, when they realize you heard every dismissive comment, witnessed every assumption, observed every conversation that questioned whether women belong in SEAL teams, the reactions are going to be intense. I'm counting on it, Petty Officer. Sometimes intense reactions are necessary for genuine cultural change." Rachel continued toward the auditorium, aware that word was already spreading through the compound with the speed of electronic communication. Personnel who saw her SEAL trident were immediately texting teammates, posting to internal message boards, and spreading the news through informal networks that connected the entire naval special warfare community. By the time the all-hands meeting began, most attendees would already know that Commander Chen was not who she had appeared to be. Inside the auditorium, personnel were gathering in the informal social clusters that characterized SEAL team culture. Team 5 occupied a section in the middle rows, with Marcus Reed sitting among his teammates. Rachel observed them from the side entrance, noting the animated conversations and frequent glances toward the stage where Captain Harrison and other senior officers were assembling. Master Chief Cortez stood near the stage stairs, and when he saw Rachel approaching, his weathered face split into a genuine smile. "Commander Chen, or should I say, Petty Officer Phantom. I had my suspicions, ma'am. But seeing that trident on your uniform confirms what I had been starting to suspect. Master Chief, I appreciate your discretion during the evaluation. Your insights about cultural dynamics were particularly valuable. Ma'am, I've been waiting years for something like this, for someone with the credibility and operational experience to force this community to confront its assumptions about women in special operations. What you're about to do is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people, but it's absolutely necessary." The auditorium was filling rapidly, with personnel claiming seats and continuing the intense conversations that Rachel's revealed SEAL qualification had triggered. She could feel the energy in the room, a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and in some cases, defensive apprehension from personnel who were beginning to realize the implications of having been observed by someone whose credentials they could not question. At precisely 0900 hours, Captain Harrison stepped to the podium and called the assembly to order. The conversations died quickly, replaced by the focused attention that military audiences provided to senior leadership during formal briefings. Harrison surveyed the room with the commanding presence of someone whose authority was unquestionable. "Good morning. I know many of you have heard rumors this morning about Commander Chen, the personnel officer who has been conducting training evaluations here for the past 2 weeks. I'm here to confirm those rumors and provide context that will be important for everyone in this auditorium to understand." The room became even more silent, if that was possible, with every person focused completely on Harrison's words. Commander Rachel Chen graduated from basic underwater demolition SEAL training 4 years ago, ranking in the top 10% of her class. She has since completed 2 combat deployments with SEAL Team 3, participating in classified operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. She has earned the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire, along with multiple other decorations for combat valor. Her call sign, earned through operational performance rather than training humor, is Phantom, given to her by her teammates after she successfully infiltrated a Taliban compound extracted 3 captured aid workers, and exfiltrated without the enemy realizing she had been there until the next morning. Rachel watched the audience's reaction carefully. Many faces showed shock and disbelief, while others displayed dawning recognition as pieces of the past 2 weeks suddenly made sense in retrospect. Marcus Reed's face had gone pale, his expression showing the horrified realization that every dismissive comment he had made had been directed at someone whose operational credentials exceeded his own. Harrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of command. Authority. Commander Chen was sent here by Naval Special Warfare Command to conduct an undercover evaluation of cultural attitudes toward female integration into SEAL teams. For 2 weeks, she operated under administrative cover, deliberately presenting herself as an unremarkable personnel officer, while observing how SEAL operators interact, what assumptions they make about women in special operations roles, and whether the official culture of professional acceptance matches the actual attitudes displayed when personnel believe no one of consequence is watching. The implications were sinking in throughout the auditorium. 2 weeks of conversations, comments, and assumptions had been observed and documented by someone with unquestionable operational credibility. Personnel were exchanging uncomfortable glances, mentally reviewing everything they had said or done during the evaluation period. I'm now going to invite Commander Chen to the stage to present preliminary findings from her evaluation. I expect everyone in this auditorium to provide her the professional respect her rank and her SEAL qualification have earned. Commander? Rachel stood and walked to the podium with measured confidence, her bearing reflecting years of operational experience and the particular assurance that came from having proven herself in environments where competence was the only currency that mattered. As she took the podium, she surveyed the audience with the tactical awareness of someone trained to assess threats and opportunities in complex environments. Good morning, she began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had coordinated the rescue operation just days earlier. As Captain Harrison explained, I've spent the past 2 weeks observing this community while concealing my SEAL qualification. That decision was deliberate. I needed to see how personnel behave when they think their attitudes won't have consequences, when they believe no one important enough to challenge them is paying attention. She paused, allowing her words to resonate. What I observed was a community that is deeply divided on the question of female integration into special operations. Some of you, many of you, are genuinely committed to evaluating people based on their performance rather than their demographics. You hold everyone to the same standards. You focus on mission effectiveness, and you judge teammates by their competence and character. Rachel's expression hardened slightly. But I also observed a significant minority who harbor assumptions about female capabilities that aren't based on evidence or experience. Personnel who questioned whether women could legitimately meet SEAL standards without receiving inappropriate advantages. Operators who made dismissive comments about administrative officers having zero operational experience while conducting training evaluations, not knowing that the person they were dismissing had earned their SEAL trident. Through the exact same crucible they endured. She let her gaze travel across the audience, noting which personnel met her eyes and which looked away uncomfortably. I documented conversations in the mess hall where female SEAL candidates were discussed as experiments and diversity quotas rather than as operators who met identical standards. I observed gym sessions where female personnel's physical performance was patronizingly acknowledged as good for an admin officer, as if administrative personnel couldn't possibly maintain serious combat conditioning. I witnessed countless small dismissals and assumptions that collectively create an environment where qualified women face barriers that their male counterparts never encounter. Marcus Reed sat frozen in his seat, his face showing the particular horror of someone who was recognizing his own behavior reflected in Rachel's descriptions. His teammates glanced at him with expressions mixing sympathy and judgment. They had all participated in or witnessed the conversations Rachel was describing. But Reed had been particularly vocal in his skepticism about female integration. Last Thursday, I had the opportunity to coordinate the rescue operation that extracted Team 5 from a dangerous maritime situation, Rachel continued. During that operation, I applied tactical knowledge that I acquired through operational experience, the same kind of experience that every SEAL in this room has earned through training and deployments. The personnel involved in that rescue expressed surprise that an administrative officer could demonstrate such expertise. She leaned forward slightly, her intensity increasing. But here's what troubles me about that surprise. Nothing about my performance during that rescue should have been shocking if personnel had simply reserved judgment about my capabilities until they had evidence rather than making assumptions based on my apparent role or, let's be honest, my gender. The tactical coordination I provided was competent but not exceptional. Any SEAL with maritime operations experience could have done the same. The surprise you felt wasn't about what I did, but about who you assumed I was. The auditorium remained absolutely silent, every person grappling with the implications of Rachel's analysis. She was systematically dismantling the assumptions that had allowed qualified female operators to be dismissed or underestimated, using her own undeniable credentials as proof that those assumptions were unfounded. "I want to be clear about something," Rachel said, her tone becoming more direct. "The resistance to female integration that I documented isn't primarily about physical standards or combat capability. It's about cultural discomfort with change, about protecting traditional identities, about fear that inclusion somehow diminishes the exclusivity that has defined SEAL teams for decades. Those are human reactions to transformation. But they're also reactions that have no place in a professional military force where mission effectiveness must take priority over personal comfort." She pulled out a tablet and referenced her documented observations. "Over the past 2 weeks, I recorded 37 separate incidents where personnel made dismissive or skeptical comments about women in special operations roles. 23 of those incidents involved explicit questioning of whether female candidates could meet legitimate standards without receiving inappropriate advantages. 14 incidents included statements suggesting that women's presence in SEAL teams created unnecessary complications that compromised operational effectiveness, despite no empirical evidence supporting that claim." Rachel looked up from the tablet. "What's particularly significant is that nearly all of these incidents occurred in informal settings where personnel believed their comments wouldn't be officially documented or have professional consequences. The mess hall, the gym, casual conversations during off-duty time. This suggests that official training on professional standards and equal opportunity policies has created a surface compliance without changing underlying attitudes." Captain Harrison stepped forward, positioning himself beside Rachel at the podium. "Commander Chen's findings align with concerns that Naval Special Warfare Command has had for several years. We've implemented policies supporting female integration, but policies alone don't change culture. Culture changes when people with unquestionable credibility challenge the assumptions that perpetuate discrimination, which is exactly what Commander Chen's presence and revelation are designed to do." Harrison's expression became more stern. "Effective immediately, all SEAL teams at this command will participate in mandatory training sessions that address cultural barriers to effective integration. These sessions will be conducted by Commander Chen and other female special operators who have proven themselves in operational environments. Personnel who continue to demonstrate resistance to professional standards after these interventions will face career consequences, up to and including removal from Special Operations Forces." The weight of this announcement settled over the auditorium. Harrison was making clear that cultural resistance would no longer be tolerated, that the era of informal dismissal of female operators was ending, and that personnel would need to adapt or face consequences. Rachel resumed speaking, her tone shifting slightly towards something more personal. "I want to share something about my own experience completing BUD/S training. Like every other candidate, I endured Hell Week 5.5 days of continuous training with minimal sleep, maximum physical demands, and constant mental pressure designed to identify who has the resilience to continue when every instinct says to quit. I watched candidates twice my size ring the bell and withdraw from SIC training. I saw men who looked like they were genetically engineered for special operations fail to complete the program. And I also saw candidates who seemed unlikely succeed, and go on to become exceptional operators. She paused, her expression reflecting the intensity of those memories. What I learned during Bud S is that physical capability and mental toughness don't correlate neatly with demographics. They correlate with individual character, determination, and the capacity to endure suffering in pursuit of something greater than personal comfort. Those qualities exist across gender lines, and any evaluation system that assumes otherwise is fundamentally flawed. Master Chief Cortez, standing near the stage, began to applaud slowly. The sound was startling in the silent auditorium, but it had an immediate effect. Other senior enlisted personnel joined the applause, followed by junior operators who recognized that Cortez's gesture represented professional endorsement from one of the community's most respected figures. Within seconds, nearly half the auditorium was applauding Rachel's presentation. But not everyone was applauding. Marcus Reed remained seated with his hands in his lap, his face showing the complex emotions of someone confronting his own prejudices and their consequences. Several of his teammates were applauding, but a few others remained silent, their body language defensive and resistant to the challenge Rachel's revelation represented. As the applause faded, a young SEAL in the front rows stood and raised his hand. Captain Harrison nodded permission for him to speak. "Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer Jake Morrison, Team 7. I want to apologize on behalf of personnel who made assumptions about your capabilities based on your cover assignment. Your operational credentials are obviously exceptional, and you've earned the respect that your SEAL qualification commands." Rachel nodded acknowledgement. "Thank you, Petty Officer. I appreciate your willingness to publicly acknowledge that assumptions were made. That kind of honest recognition is the first step toward cultural change." Another SEAL stood, this one from Team 3, Rachel's former unit. "Commander Chen Phantom, some of us served with you during your deployment to Afghanistan. We watched you earn that Navy Cross. We know firsthand the kind of operator you are. Having you conduct this evaluation was brilliant because nobody here can question your credentials or suggest you don't understand what SEAL operations actually require." The statement carried significant weight because it came from someone who had served alongside Rachel in combat, who could testify to her competence from direct experience rather than abstract policy positions. It also subtly challenged anyone who might be tempted to continue questioning female capabilities after having their assumptions so thoroughly dismantled. Rachel recognized several of her former teammates scattered throughout the auditorium, their faces showing pride in what she had accomplished with this evaluation mission. Their presence and support created social pressure for other personnel to accept the legitimacy of female integration if operators who had served with female SEALs in combat endorsed their capabilities. Resistance became significantly harder to justify. But the most significant reaction, the one that would determine whether this confrontation truly transformed cultural attitudes, would come from Marcus Reed and the other personnel who had been most vocal in their skepticism. Rachel's eyes found Reed in the audience, noting his obvious discomfort and internal struggle as he processed the revelation that his dismissive assumptions had been directed at someone whose operational credentials exceeded his own. The all-hands meeting concluded with Captain Harrison dismissing personnel back to their regular duties, but the energy in the auditorium suggested that normal routines would be difficult to resume. Personnel gathered in small groups, engaged in intense conversations about Commander Chen's revelation and its implications for the SEAL community's culture and future. Marcus Reed remained seated long after most of the auditorium had emptied, his teammates having left him alone with his thoughts, recognizing that he needed to process his realization privately before engaging with others. His mind was replaying every interaction, every dismissive comment, every assumption he had made about the administrative officer who had turned out to be a combat-decorated SEAL with credentials that made his own impressive record look ordinary by comparison. The mess hall comment haunted him, particularly his casual statement about administrative officers having zero operational experience while conducting training evaluations, delivered loudly enough for Commander Chen to clearly hear. At the time, he had felt confident in his assessment, secure in his assumptions about who belonged in special operations spaces and who didn't. Now, That confidence felt like the arrogant blindness of someone who had mistaken limited perspective for comprehensive understanding. Master Chief Cortez approached Reed's seat, settling into the chair beside him with the deliberate care of someone whose body had absorbed decades of physical punishment. "Petty officer, you look like someone who's just had his worldview significantly adjusted." Reed glanced at the Master Chief, his expression showing a mixture of shame and defensive resistance. "Master Chief, I made assumptions that turned out to be completely wrong." Commander Chen overheard comments I made, questioning whether women could legitimately meet SEAL standards, and the entire time she was someone who had not only met those standards, but exceeded them. "That's an accurate assessment," Cortez agreed, without offering easy reassurance. "You questioned the legitimacy of female operators while one was standing right there, documenting your skepticism for an official evaluation that will influence naval special warfare policies for years to come. That's going to have consequences, Reed." The blunt statement hit hard, as Cortez had intended. Reed needed to confront the full magnitude of his mistake, rather than being allowed to minimize it or retreat into defensive justifications. "Master Chief, I never meant to disrespect actual operators. My concerns were about maintaining standards and ensuring that political pressure didn't compromise the requirements that keep SEAL teams effective. And that sounds like a reasonable position until you examine it closely," Cortez replied with the patient firmness of someone who had confronted these arguments many times before. "Because what you're really saying is that you assumed women couldn't meet legitimate standards, which required you to invent a narrative about political pressure and compromised requirements to explain why some women were succeeding. You created a conspiracy theory rather than accepting the simpler explanation that qualified women exist and can meet the same standards you met." Reed started to respond, then stopped, as he recognized the accuracy of Cortez's analysis. His skepticism hadn't been based on evidence of lowered standards or compromised training. It had been based on his assumption that women couldn't succeed at the highest levels of special operations, which required him to question the legitimacy of any woman who did succeed. "I watched Commander Chen complete BUD-S training," Cortez continued quietly. "I was serving as an instructor cadre during her Hell Week evolution. I saw her endure the same suffering every other candidate endured. I watched her complete the same physically demanding tasks, meet the same time standards, demonstrate the same mental toughness that earned SEAL qualification. And I also watched how some instructors and fellow candidates treated her, the additional scrutiny, the constant skepticism, the assumption that any difficulty she experienced proved women weren't cut out for this work while male candidates who struggled were just having a tough day." The Master Chief's expression hardened slightly. "So, when you questioned whether female SEALs received inappropriate advantages during training, you were not just wrong, you were inverting reality. Female candidates face additional barriers that male candidates never encounter. Barriers created by people who have decided in advance that women don't belong and interpret every piece of evidence to support that predetermined conclusion." Reed absorbed this in silence, feeling the weight of his complicity in perpetuating those barriers. He had never considered himself prejudiced or discriminatory. He had simply believed he was maintaining standards and protecting the integrity of SEAL teams. But Cortez's words forced him to recognize that his beliefs had been shaped more by assumptions and cultural biases than by objective evaluation of evidence. "Master Chief, what do I do now? How do I make this right?" Cortez considered the question thoughtfully. "First, you acknowledge the mistake publicly and specifically. Not a generic "I'm sorry if anyone was offended" non-apology, but a direct admission that you questioned the capabilities of female operators without evidence and that you were wrong. Second, you examine how your assumptions affected your behavior and you commit to changing those patterns. Third, you become an advocate for fair evaluation of all personnel regardless of demographics, using your credibility within the SEAL community to challenge the same assumptions you once held. That's going to be difficult, Master Chief. Some of my teammates share the views I expressed. They're going to see any public acknowledgement as weakness or betrayal of our community's standards. Then you'll learn who your real teammates are," Cortez said firmly. "Because the SEALs who matter The operators who prioritize mission effectiveness over cultural comfort will respect you more for having the courage to admit mistakes and grow from them. The ones who criticize you for changing your mind when presented with new evidence? They're not the operators you want to serve alongside in high-stakes environments where rigid thinking gets people killed. Rachel appeared at the top of the auditorium stairs, her presence immediately drawing both men's attention. She descended toward where Reed and Cortez sat, her expression professionally neutral, but her bearing radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had proven every point she needed to make. "Petty Officer Reed," she said as she approached. "Master Chief Cortez. May I join you?" Reed stood quickly, his military bearing reasserting itself automatically, despite his emotional turmoil. "Of course, ma'am. Please." He gestured to a nearby chair, his discomfort obvious, but his courtesy genuine. Rachel settled into the morning chair, creating an informal triangle with Reed and Cortez. For a moment, silence stretched between them, Reed struggling to find appropriate words, Rachel waiting patiently, Cortez observing the interaction with the interest of someone who understood its significance. "Ma'am," Reed began carefully, "I need to apologize for my behavior and comments over the past 2 weeks. I made assumptions about your experience and capabilities based on your apparent role, and those assumptions led me to make dismissive comments that were disrespectful to you personally and to all female operators who have earned SEAL qualification." Rachel nodded acknowledgement but waited for him to continue, recognizing that Reed needed to fully articulate his understanding of what he had done wrong rather than being allowed to offer a brief apology and move on. "Specifically," Reed continued, his voice showing the strain of genuine self-examination, "I questioned whether women could legitimately meet SEAL standards without receiving inappropriate advantages. I made comments in the mess hall, suggesting that your presence here represented bureaucratic interference with operational effectiveness. I dismissed your capabilities during the PT session we shared in the gym. And most significantly, I participated in and encouraged a culture that assumes female operators are less legitimate than male operators unless proven otherwise, which creates an impossible standard because the proof is never considered sufficient." The specificity of his acknowledgement surprised Rachel slightly. This was more than the generic apology she had expected. Reed was demonstrating genuine understanding of how his attitudes had contributed to the cultural barriers she had been sent to document and address. "Ma'am, I don't know if this matters," Reed said quietly, "but last Thursday, when you coordinated our rescue operation, your tactical guidance potentially saved my life and the lives of my teammates. You demonstrated exactly the kind of competence and leadership that I claim to value, but I would never have seen it if circumstances hadn't forced you to reveal capabilities that should have been apparent from the beginning if I hadn't been blinded by my assumptions." Rachel allowed a long pause before responding, letting Reed's words and the weight of his recognition settle fully. "Petty Officer Reed, I appreciate your willingness to specifically acknowledge your mistakes. That takes courage, especially in a community that often equates admitting error with showing weakness." She leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more direct. "But I want you to understand something important. This isn't really about me personally. I have the credentials and the combat record to withstand skepticism and prove my legitimacy to anyone who questions it. The real problem is what your attitudes, and the attitudes of others who share your previous assumptions do to female operators who don't have my specific background, or who are still trying to earn their qualifications while facing constant skepticism about whether they belong." Reed nodded, showing he was following her reasoning. "Every female candidate who attempts BUD/S training does so knowing that her performance will be scrutinized far more intensely than her male counterparts." Rachel continued, "She knows that if she struggles with anything, it will be interpreted as proof that women can't meet standards, while male candidates who struggle are just having a tough day. She knows that if she succeeds, people like you, people who've never served with her or observed her performance directly, will question whether the standards were lowered or she received inappropriate advantages." Rachel's intensity increased. "That's the real damage your assumptions create. Not personal offense to me, but structural barriers that make it unnecessarily difficult for qualified women to earn positions they're capable of filling. You create a situation where female operators have to be twice as good to be considered half as legitimate, and even then, people question their credentials. Reed absorbed this with visible discomfort, recognizing the systemic nature of the problem he had participated in perpetuating. "Ma'am, how do we fix this? How do we create an environment where female candidates are evaluated fairly and female operators are respected based on their actual performance, rather than having to constantly prove themselves against skepticism?" "You start by holding everyone to identical standards and accepting the results when people meet them," Rachel replied. "You stop inventing explanations for why women who succeed must have had some inappropriate advantage. You challenge your teammates when they make dismissive assumptions about female capabilities. And you recognize that diversity in special operations forces, when based on genuine qualification, makes teams more effective, not less, because different perspectives and experiences enhance tactical problem solving." Master Chief Cortez spoke up, adding his perspective to the conversation. "Petty Officer Reed, one of the most important things you can do is share your evolution publicly. When other SEALs see someone they respect, acknowledge that his assumptions were wrong and commit to changing his attitudes. It creates permission for them to examine their own biases without feeling like they're betraying the community." Reed considered this, recognizing the logic but also feeling apprehensive about the social consequences of publicly challenging views that many of his peers still held. "Master Chief, ma'am, I'm willing to do that. But I need to be honest, it's going to be difficult. Some of my closest teammates believe the things I used to believe. They're going to see my acknowledgement as weakness or political correctness rather than genuine growth. Then you'll discover which of your teammates prioritize mission effectiveness over cultural comfort," Rachel said, echoing Cortez's earlier statement. "The SEALs worth serving alongside will respect your willingness to adapt your thinking when presented with evidence. The ones who don't? They're the operators who'll get people killed in complex operational environments where rigid assumptions don't survive contact with reality." She stood, preparing to leave but offering one final observation. "Petty Officer Reed, I don't need your apology for my own sake. I've endured far worse than dismissive comments from skeptical colleagues. But the female SEALs who come after me, the women who are currently attempting qualification, the candidates who will enter the pipeline in future years, they need operators like you to examine your assumptions and change the culture that creates unnecessary barriers to their success. That's how you make this right. Not through apologies to me, but through advocacy for fair evaluation of everyone who attempts to earn SEAL qualification." Rachel walked toward the auditorium exit, leaving Reed and Cortez to continue their conversation. As she passed through the doorway, she noticed several SEALs gathered in the hallway, personnel who had been waiting to speak with her, to ask questions about her evaluation findings, or simply to express their respect for what she had accomplished, both operationally and through this cultural intervention mission. Among them was Lieutenant Jake Morrison from SEAL Team 7, the operator who had publicly apologized during the all-hands meeting. "Ma'am, a group of us would like to request your participation in some upcoming training exercises. Not as an evaluator, but as an active operator whose tactical expertise would be valuable for our development. We think having female SEALs integrated into training evolutions would help normalize their presence and demonstrate the capabilities you've been describing." Rachel considered the request thoughtfully. "Lieutenant Morrison, I'd be happy to participate in training exercises, but on one condition. I'm not there as a representative of all female operators or as proof that women can perform special operations work. I'm there as one SEAL among many, contributing my specific skills and experience to collective training objectives." "Understood, ma'am. That's exactly what we want to start treating female SEALs as normal members of the community rather than as exceptions or experiments that need special accommodation or constant evaluation." Behind them, Marcus Reed emerged from the auditorium, his expression showing the exhaustion of genuine self-examination. He noticed the group gathered around Rachel and hesitated, uncertain whether his presence would be welcome. Rachel caught his eye, and gestured for him to join them, creating an opportunity for him to begin rebuilding his reputation within a community that had witnessed his very public confrontation with his own assumptions. 3 months after, Commander Rachel Phantom Chen's evaluation was revealed. Naval Base Coronado had undergone a transformation that was both subtle and profound. The physical infrastructure remained unchanged. The same buildings housed SEAL teams. The same training facilities pushed operators to their limits. The same Pacific Ocean provided the backdrop for maritime operations. But the culture had shifted in ways that would have been impossible to legislate or mandate through policy alone. Rachel sat in her new office, no longer a temporary administrative space but rather the permanent quarters of the Deputy Commander for Training Development at Naval Special Warfare Command. Her promotion and reassignment had been announced 6 weeks after her evaluation report was submitted, recognizing both her operational credentials and her demonstrated capability for addressing complex cultural challenges. The comprehensive evaluation she had conducted at Coronado had been expanded into a Naval Special Warfare-wide assessment, with similar undercover observations being conducted at SEAL facilities across the country. Her findings had informed new training protocols, updated evaluation standards, and most significantly, mandatory cultural competency programs that required all SEAL personnel to examine their assumptions about teammate capabilities and commit to evaluation based on performance rather than demographics. The changes hadn't been universally welcomed. Several senior SEALs had requested transfers rather than adapt to the new cultural expectations, viewing the emphasis on fair evaluation of female operators as political correctness that compromised the elite identity of Special Operations Forces. Their departures had been accepted without ceremony. Naval Special Warfare Command had made clear that operators who couldn't prioritize mission effectiveness over personal comfort had no place in modern Special Operations Forces, regardless of their tactical skills. But the majority of SEAL personnel had responded positively, many expressing relief that long-standing cultural issues were finally being addressed openly rather than being ignored or minimized. Master Chief Cortez had been proven correct in his assessment that most operators genuinely wanted to serve in units that valued competence over demographics, where teammates were judged by their performance rather than their conformity to traditional appearance expectations. Marcus Reed had emerged as one of the most vocal advocates for cultural change, using his credibility within the SEAL community to challenge the assumptions he had once held. His willingness to publicly acknowledge his mistakes and describe his evolution had been featured in training materials used across naval special warfare, providing a model for other operators who were grappling with similar questions about female integration. 2 weeks after the Coronado revelation, Reed had requested a meeting with Rachel to discuss how he could contribute to improving evaluation fairness and cultural attitudes. That conversation had led to him volunteering as a mentor for candidates, both male and female, during Bud's training, where his combat experience and hard-won understanding of bias made him effective at identifying when assumptions were affecting evaluations. His transformation hadn't been without cost. Some of his former close teammates had distanced themselves, viewing his advocacy for female integration as betrayal of SEAL culture. But he had also formed new bonds with operators who shared his commitment to mission effectiveness over cultural tradition, finding that his circle of trusted colleagues had become more diverse and ultimately stronger. Rachel's office wall now displayed photographs from recent training exercises where female SEALs had participated as normal team members rather than as representatives of their gender or subjects of constant evaluation. The images showed integrated teams conducting complex operations with the fluid coordination that came from mutual trust and shared competence operators who evaluated each other based on performance rather than demographics. One photograph in particular held significant meaning. A candid shot from a maritime training evolution showing Rachel working alongside Marcus Reed and other Team 5 members, all focused intensely on a tactical problem they were solving collaboratively. The image had been taken by Master Chief Cortez, who had sent it to Rachel with a note. "This is what right looks like operators operating, with no asterisks or qualifications based on who they are versus what they can do." Petty Officer Stevens appeared in Rachel's doorway, his demeanor much more confident than during the evaluation period when he had served as her administrative assistant. "Ma'am, the candidates from the current BUD/S class are assembled for your address. Captain Harrison is ready when you are." Rachel stood and collected her notes, preparing for one of her regular sessions addressing SEAL candidates who were midway through the training pipeline. These sessions had become a fixture of the training curriculum, opportunities for candidates to hear directly from female operators about their experiences, to ask questions about standards and evaluation, and to begin developing the cultural competency that would be expected of them as qualified SEALs. The training auditorium was filled with approximately 60 candidates, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that characterized the mid-BUDS phase, when the initial adrenaline had faded but the finish line remained frustratingly distant. Among them were 4 female candidates, their presence no longer remarkable enough to generate the intense scrutiny that earlier female candidates had endured. Rachel took the podium and surveyed the audience, seeing in their faces the same determination and doubt that she had felt during her own time as a candidate. "Good afternoon. I'm Commander Rachel Chen, Deputy Commander for Training Development. My call sign is Phantom, earned during combat operations in Afghanistan. I'm here today to talk with you about standards, evaluation, and the culture you'll be entering if you successfully complete this training." She paused, letting them absorb her SEAL qualification and combat credentials, establishing that she spoke from direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge or administrative authority. "First, I want to address something directly to the female candidates in this class, though the male candidates need to hear this as well. You will be held to identical standards as your male counterparts. Not higher standards, not lower standards, identical standards. Every timed evolution, every physical requirement, every evaluation criterion applies equally to everyone attempting to earn SEAL qualification." Rachel noticed the female candidates sitting straighter, their attention sharpening at this explicit statement of equality. "However, I won't pretend that your experience will be identical to male candidates. You will face additional scrutiny because some evaluators and fellow candidates carry assumptions about female capabilities that will influence how they interpret your performance. When you struggle with something, it may be viewed as evidence that women aren't suited for special operations, while male candidates who struggle are just having a difficult day. When you succeed at something, people may question whether standards were lowered rather than accepting that you met legitimate requirements." The honesty of her assessment resonated through the auditorium. She wasn't offering false reassurance or pretending that discrimination had been eliminated, but rather acknowledging the reality that female candidates would encounter while also committing to addressing it. "The cultural changes we're implementing are designed to minimize that additional scrutiny and ensure evaluations are based on performance rather than assumptions. But culture changes slowly, and you may encounter instructors or fellow operators who haven't fully adapted to expectations of fair evaluation. When that happens, you have multiple avenues for addressing concerns, and I personally commit to ensuring that legitimate complaints are investigated and addressed." She shifted her focus to address all the candidates collectively. "For the male candidates in this room, I want you to understand something crucial. The presence of qualified female operators in SEAL teams makes those teams more effective, not less. Diverse perspectives enhance tactical problem solving. Different physical capabilities can be advantageous in specific operational contexts. And the ability to work effectively with teammates who don't look like you or share your background is increasingly important in the complex operational environments where special operations forces are deployed." Rachel noticed several male candidates nodding in agreement. The younger generation of SEALs seemed more comfortable with integration than some of their senior counterparts, having grown up in a military that had been steadily expanding female participation in combat roles. "I also want to address something to candidates who may be harboring doubts about whether female teammates can perform at the level special operations requires. Those doubts are understandable, given that female integration into SEAL teams is relatively recent and you may not have directly observed female operators in action. But I'm going to ask you to reserve judgment until you have actual evidence and to recognize that your assumptions, positive or negative, can become self-fulfilling prophecies if they affect how you interact with teammates. She pulled up a photograph on the large display screen behind her, an image from her Afghanistan deployment, showing her team in full combat gear, positioned in a defensive formation, while coordinating air support during a firefight. This photograph was taken during the operation where I earned the Navy Cross. My team was pinned down by enemy fighters in a compound, taking fire from multiple directions while attempting to evacuate wounded personnel. For 40 minutes, I held a defensive position that prevented enemy fighters from overrunning our location while coordinating our extraction. Rachel pointed to specific figures in the photograph. The operators you see here didn't care about my gender during that firefight. They cared about whether I could accurately return fire, whether I could maintain defensive integrity under pressure, whether I could coordinate tactical communications while managing my own sector. Every one of those men trusted me with their lives because I had proven my competence through performance, not because of policy requirements or political correctness. The auditorium was completely silent, candidates processing the visual evidence of Rachel's combat experience and recognizing that theoretical debates about female capabilities became irrelevant when real bullets were being exchanged. If you complete this training, you'll be assigned to SEAL teams where you may serve with female operators. I expect you to evaluate those teammates exactly as you would evaluate any other operator, based on their demonstrated competence, their reliability under pressure, their contribution to mission success. Nothing more, nothing less. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. But I also expect you to challenge assumptions when you encounter them. If a teammate makes dismissive comments about female operators without evidence, speak up. If evaluation standards are being applied inconsistently based on gender, report it. If cultural attitudes are creating barriers to fair assessment, recognize that maintaining those barriers compromises your team's effectiveness and ultimately puts lives at risk. Captain Harrison joined Rachel at the podium, his presence adding command authority to her message. Candidates. Commander Chen's evaluation at this facility 3 months ago revealed cultural issues that Naval Special Warfare Command is committed to addressing systematically. The changes we're implementing aren't about lowering standards or accommodating social preferences. They're about ensuring that we identify and develop the most capable operators regardless of demographics. That serves mission effectiveness, which is the only metric that ultimately matters. He gestured toward Rachel. Commander Chen represents exactly what we need more of in naval special warfare. Operators with exceptional tactical skills, combat-proven leadership, and the courage to challenge cultural patterns that compromise our effectiveness. Study her example, learn from her experience, and commit to being the kind of SEAL who evaluates people based on what they can do rather than on assumptions about what they should be able to do. After the formal address concluded, Rachel made herself available for individual questions from candidates who wanted more specific guidance. Several female candidates approached, their expressions showing a mixture of determination and apprehension about the challenges they knew they would face during the remainder of training. A particularly young-looking female candidate, probably no more than 22 years old, waited until the others had finished before approaching Rachel hesitantly. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. How did you keep going during Hell Week when you knew everyone was watching to see if you'd be the one to prove that women couldn't make it?" "I'm already feeling that pressure, and I'm not even to the hardest parts of training yet." Rachel recognized the vulnerability and honesty in the question, understanding that this young woman was grappling with the psychological burden that came with being evaluated not just as an individual but as a representative of her entire gender's capabilities. "I won't lie to you and say the pressure wasn't intense," Rachel replied. "I knew that if I failed, it would be used as evidence that women couldn't meet SEAL standards, while male candidates who failed would just be individuals who weren't ready for special operations. That additional burden was exhausting and fundamentally unfair." The candidate nodded, clearly relating to this experience. "But I also realized that I couldn't control how other people interpreted my performance or what narratives they constructed about female capabilities," Rachel continued. The only thing I could control was my own effort, my own determination to meet every standard that was set before me. So I focused on that, on being the best candidate I could be, on supporting my teammates, on refusing to quit regardless of how much pain or doubt I was experiencing. She placed a hand on the young candidate's shoulder. You're not responsible for proving that all women can be SEALs. You're only responsible for proving that you specifically have what it takes to earn qualification. Let your performance speak for itself. Trust the standards that have been established, and recognize that people's assumptions are their problem, not yours. The candidate's expression showed relief and determination. Thank you, ma'am. That helps more than you know. As the training facility emptied and candidates returned to their demanding schedules, Rachel stood quietly, observing the space where the next generation of SEALs was being forged. The transformation she had initiated at Coronado was spreading throughout naval special warfare, creating conditions where qualified women could earn positions based on merit, rather than having to overcome cultural barriers that existed independently of actual performance standards. Marcus Reed appeared in the auditorium entrance, his presence a reminder of how significantly individuals could evolve when challenged to examine their assumptions. He had requested this meeting to discuss his observations from mentoring current BUD/S candidates, providing Rachel with ongoing intelligence about how cultural changes were being received by personnel at various levels. "Ma'am, do you have a few minutes?" Reed asked respectfully. "Of course, petty officer. Come in." They settled into seats in the now empty auditorium, the space that had witnessed so many significant conversations over recent months. Reed pulled out a tablet displaying notes from his mentoring sessions with candidates. "Ma'am, I wanted to share some observations about the current training class. The cultural shift we've been implementing is definitely having an impact. I'm seeing male candidates who are significantly more comfortable working with female teammates than my generation was. They focus on performance rather than gender, and they challenge each other when someone makes assumptions about female capabilities." Rachel nodded with satisfaction. "That's exactly the kind of generational change we need to cultivate." "What about the instructors? Are they applying standards consistently?" "Most are doing well," Reed replied. "There are a few who are struggling to adapt, instructors who are used to making assumptions about candidate capabilities based on physical appearance or demographics. But when those inconsistencies are pointed out, they're generally willing to adjust their evaluation approach." He paused, his expression becoming more thoughtful. "Ma'am, I wanted to tell you something personal. 3 months ago, when you revealed your SEAL qualification and confronted my assumptions, I felt like my identity was being attacked. I had built my self-concept around being part of an elite community with specific characteristics, and your presence challenged what I believed that community should look like." Rachel listened attentively, recognizing that Reed was sharing genuine introspection rather than offering surface-level compliance with new policies. "But over the past 3 months, working with female candidates and serving alongside female operators during training exercises, I've realized that my identity was built on exclusion rather than excellence." Reed continued. "I defined being a SEAL partly by who wasn't a SEAL, who didn't belong, who couldn't meet standards. That's a fundamentally weak foundation for identity because it requires constantly protecting boundaries rather than celebrating competence." He looked at Rachel directly. "Now, I'm trying to rebuild my understanding of what being a SEAL means, focusing on the capabilities and character that actually matter for mission success rather than on maintaining traditional demographics. It's uncomfortable sometimes, but it's also liberating, because I don't have to spend energy defending arbitrary boundaries that don't serve operational effectiveness." Rachel felt genuine respect for Reed's willingness to articulate his evolution so clearly. "Petty officer, what you're describing is exactly the kind of cultural transformation naval special warfare needs. You're not just complying with new policies, you're examining the underlying assumptions that created the need for those policies and committing to different values that better serve our mission. Ma'am, I know I can't undo the damage my previous attitudes caused or erase the comments I made during your evaluation period. but I'm committed to using whatever credibility I have within the SEAL community to advocate for the changes you've initiated. If my evolution can help other operators examine their own assumptions, then maybe something positive can come from my mistakes. That's all any of us can do. Petty officer, learn from our mistakes and commit to better understanding going forward. Your advocacy will have significant impact because it comes from someone who once held skeptical views and changed them based on evidence rather than from someone who never struggled with these questions. As their conversation concluded and Reed departed to return to his duties, Rachel remained in the quiet auditorium, reflecting on how far naval special warfare had come in just 3 months and how much further the transformation still needed to progress. Cultural change was measured in years and decades, not weeks and months. But the foundation had been established, standards clearly communicated, evaluation, fairness emphasized, cultural competency required, and consequences enforced for personnel who prioritized tradition over effectiveness. The evening sun cast long shadows through the auditorium windows, creating patterns of light and darkness that seemed metaphorically appropriate. Rachel thought about the female SEAL candidates currently enduring Hell Week, about the operators deployed in hostile territories, where teammate competence mattered infinitely more than teammate demographics, about the future generations of special operations forces who would inherit the culture being constructed through deliberate intervention and sustained commitment. Her evaluation mission at Coronado had accomplished its immediate objectives, documenting cultural barriers, identifying personnel whose attitudes compromised unit effectiveness, and creating conditions for meaningful change. But the more significant achievement was the ongoing transformation that her revelation had catalyzed. The conversations that continued daily throughout naval special warfare as operators grappled with questions about identity, tradition, and excellence. Rachel stood and walked toward the auditorium exit, pausing at the doorway to look back at the empty space that had witnessed so much significant evolution. In a few hours, it would fill again with candidates, instructors, and operators, continuing the demanding work of forging exceptional warriors. But now, that work was being conducted in an environment that valued competence over conformity, that evaluated people based on demonstrated capability rather than assumed limitations. The mess hall where Marcus Reed had once dismissed her as an administrative officer with zero operational experience was visible through the auditorium windows, its lights beginning to illuminate as evening approached and personnel gathered for dinner. Rachel smiled slightly, remembering that moment and recognizing how Reed's casual arrogance had actually provided the perfect illustration of the cultural issues she had been sent to document. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget. She left the auditorium and walked across the compound toward her quarters, her SEAL trident catching the fading sunlight and reflecting the gold insignia that represented everything she had endured and achieved. Behind her, the Naval Special Warfare facilities continued their essential work of preparing the next generation of operators, now guided by cultural values that recognized excellence wherever it emerged, regardless of whether it arrived in packages that matched traditional expectations. The transformation was incomplete and would require sustained commitment from leadership at every level. But the foundation had been established. The conversation had been initiated, and the precedent had been set that naval special warfare would prioritize mission effectiveness over cultural comfort, would hold everyone to identical standards and accept the results when people met them, and would not tolerate attitudes that created unnecessary barriers to qualified personnel, earning positions they were capable of filling. Rachel Phantom Chen had completed her evaluation mission, revealed her true identity in the most impactful way possible, and transformed cultural attitudes through the undeniable authority of her operational credentials and combat record. The mess hall had indeed been silenced by her response to dismissive assumptions, not through aggressive confrontation, but through the systematic dismantling of prejudice using evidence, experience, and the particular credibility that came from having proven herself in the same crucible that defined SEAL identity. And in doing so, She had opened doors that would never again be closed to qualified women seeking to serve their country in special operations forces, ensuring that future generations would be evaluated based on their capabilities, rather than on assumptions about what those capabilities should be based on demographics that had no correlation with operational effectiveness. The San Diego evening settled over Coronado, marking the end of another day in the ongoing transformation of naval special warfare, a transformation that would be remembered, not for dramatic confrontations or policy mandates, but for one commander's patient intelligence gathering, tactical revelation, and undeniable demonstration that excellence transcends the arbitrary boundaries that prejudice constructs to protect traditions that no longer serve the missions they were meant to support. The story ends here, but the journey continues. Many new adventures are waiting for you, and if you enjoyed, please take a moment to like, subscribe to our eStory channel, and turn on the bell. See you in the next story.